The morning mist had just begun to lift over Silver Pine Valley when three riders appeared on the ridge, silhouettes stark against the pale dawn sky. They paused, surveying the small homestead below, where smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. "That's the place," the lead rider muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "Widow Blackwood's farm." Little did they know that the quiet woman who worked that land had once been called Midnight Eleanor across the Western Territories. A legend who could track, aim, and kill with uncanny precision, even blindfolded. The woman who'd hunted 1,000 buffalo without missing a single shot. The woman whose name made hardened hunters fall silent with respect. The outlaws were about to learn that some legends don't fade. They just hibernate until necessity awakens them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Blackwood's day began like any other on her small Silver Pine homestead. At 43, her once raven black hair now carried streaks of silver, pulled back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her hands, once famous for their steadiness with a Sharps rifle, now kneaded bread dough with methodical precision. Through the kitchen window, she watched her daughter, Hannah, gathering eggs from the henhouse. At 17, Hannah had her mother's, and keen eyes and quiet determination, but none of her darkness. Eleanor had made certain of that. The girl moved with the lightness of youth, unaware of the shadow that had once been her mother's constant companion. "Mama, the Parker's Rhode Island Red is laying in our coop again," Hannah called, holding up an unusually large brown egg. "Should I take it over to them later?" Eleanor smiled, the expression softening the weather-worn lines of her face. "That's thoughtful, honey. You can ride over after your lessons." For 7 years, they'd lived in this peaceful corner of Colorado Territory, far from the whispers that had once followed Eleanor across the plains. Here, she was just Widow Blackwood, who sold the finest butter and preserved goods at the Silver Pine General Store, who taught the school children how to read twice a week, who kept to herself but was always ready with a helping hand when neighbors fell ill. No one here knew that those hands had once been famous from Cheyenne to Kansas City. No one knew that Midnight Eleanor Blackwood had outshot every man in 6 territories, had hunted game that seasoned trackers couldn't find, had earned her nickname by demonstrating her most incredible skill, hunting buffalo while blindfolded, using only her other senses to locate, aim, and fire with deadly accuracy. Eleanor wiped flour from her hands and moved to the blackened tin box on the highest shelf. She opened it only when Hannah was outside, when the memories grew too strong to ignore. Inside lay folded newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. Midnight. Eleanor outdraws the masculine competition again. Famous huntress provides meat for northern Cheyenne through winter. Blindfolded buffalo hunt astounds witnesses beneath the clippings lay a simple black silk scarf, frayed at the edges from years of use, her blindfold. Eleanor ran her fingers over the worn fabric, feeling the familiar texture that had once been as much a part of her as her own skin. 7 years since she'd worn it. 7 years since her husband Thomas had died in that mining accident, leaving her alone with a 10-year-old daughter and a decision to make: continue the life that had made her infamous, or create a new one where Hannah could grow up without the burden of her mother's legend. Eleanor had chosen peace, trading her Sharps rifle for a butter churn, her buckskins for a simple house dress, her blindfold for a widow's somber attire. She'd sold off the buffalo gun to a collector in Denver, keeping only her husband's old Spencer carbine for protection and hunting. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her from her memories. Eleanor quickly returned the box to its hiding place and moved to the window. Riders approaching, not the usual neighborly visit from the looks of it. 3 men, unfamiliar, their posture suggesting purpose rather than casual passing through. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, old instincts surfacing. Her hand reached automatically for a weapon that was no longer at her hip, a movement so ingrained it had become reflex. Instead, she smoothed her apron and called out to her daughter, "Hannah, come inside now, please." The girl looked up, registered the change in her mother's tone, and immediately headed for the house. Even at 17, Hannah had never questioned that particular tone. It was rare enough that she recognized its importance. As Hannah hurried inside, Eleanor noted how the three riders slowed, watching her daughter with too much interest. Eleanor's spine stiffened, her mind cataloguing details with a precision most would find unnerving. The way the lead rider favored his right side, suggesting a healed injury, the nervous twitch of the second man's hands near his holster, the calculating gaze of the third that marked him as the true danger. "Who are they, Mama?" Hannah asked, closing the door behind her. "I don't know, honey," Eleanor replied, her voice calm, but her eyes never leaving the approaching men. "But I want you to go to the root cellar, take the back door. Don't come up until I call the all clear." Hannah hesitated. "But Mama—" "Now, Hannah." The tone brooked no argument. As Hannah reluctantly headed for the cellar, Eleanor reached for Thomas's old Spencer carbine over the fireplace. It wasn't her buffalo gun, wasn't the custom sharps, with its perfect balance and hair trigger that had once felt like an extension of her own arm. But it would do. The riders stopped in front of the house, dust settling around their horses. The leader, a man with a scarred face partially hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, touched his fingers to the brim in mocking courtesy. "Mrs. Blackwood?" His voice carried a false pleasantness that did nothing to mask the menace beneath. Eleanor stepped onto the porch, the Spencer held casually at her side, not threatening but present. Her stance was that of a simple homesteader, but those who had known her in her previous life would have recognized the subtle shift in her posture, the centered balance that had once made her famous for her steadiness, even when she stopped. "Moving horses. Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice carrying the pleasant tone of any frontier woman greeting strangers, revealing nothing of the calculations running through her mind. Distances, angles, the position of the sun, the direction of the wind. "Hope so, ma'am," the leader replied. "Name's Jared Hawkins. These are my associates, Mr. Reed and Mr. Decker. We're looking to acquire some property in these parts, and yours has been recommended." Eleanor's expression remained pleasant, unreadable. "I'm afraid my land isn't for sale, Mr. Hawkins." "Not ever. Silver Pine has plenty of unclaimed territory if you're looking to settle." Something shifted in Hawkins' eyes. A coldness, a calculation. "Well, now, that's a shame. We had our hearts set on this particular piece. Has good water, good positioning. Strategic, you might say." The way he emphasized strategic told Eleanor everything she needed to know. These weren't prospective settlers, or even ordinary land grabbers. The emerging railroad lines were pushing through these territories, and certain stretches of land had become valuable for less than legal purposes. Her property, with its natural pass through the mountains, would be perfect for ambushing trains carrying payroll or gold shipments. "As I said, not for sale. Now I've got bread in the oven and chores waiting. Good day, gentlemen." Eleanor turned as if to go back inside, watching their reflections in the window glass. "That's a mighty pretty daughter you've got, Mrs. Blackwood." Hawkins called after her, his tone making the compliment an unmistakable threat. "Be a shame if anything happened to her. Times being what they are, dangerous for a young girl." Eleanor froze, her hand on the doorframe. A new calculation ran through. Her mind, not one of angles and distances, but of consequences. For 7 years, she'd kept her past buried and kept Midnight Eleanor locked away, but some threats couldn't be answered as Widow Blackwood. She turned slowly, meeting Hawkins' gaze directly for the first time. Something in her eyes, some glimpse of the woman she'd once been, must have shone through, because the smirk on his face faltered slightly. "Mr. Hawkins," she said, her voice still pleasant but carrying a new undertone that made the horses shift nervously. "My answer remains. No, I suggest you and your associates move along. Silver Pine is a peaceful community. We like to keep it that way." The message wasn't lost on Hawkins, whose eyes narrowed as he studied her more carefully, perhaps sensing something beneath the widow's calm exterior. After a moment, he nodded tightly and turned his horse. "We'll be seeing you again, Mrs. Blackwood," he called over his shoulder. "People around here might be interested to know who their neighbor really is." As the riders disappeared down the road, Eleanor's grip tightened on the Spencer carbine. The last comment confirmed her suspicions. Hawkins knew something of her past, or thought he did. She watched until they were out of sight before calling. Hannah from the cellar, her mind already racing ahead. Tonight, she would need to open the chest beneath her bed, the one Hannah had never seen. Inside lay the last remnants of Midnight Eleanor, a pair of buckskin gloves worn smooth by years of use, a custom holster that had once held her sidearm, and most importantly, her journal with records of every shot, every hunt, every skill she'd perfected. After 7 years of peace, it seemed the legend might need to rise again. Silver Pine was the kind of town that appeared on maps as an afterthought, a small dot nestled in the Colorado foothills, where life moved with the predictable rhythm of seasons. Main Street boasted only essential establishments: Dawson's General Store, the Silver Pine Hotel and Saloon, a small church and Sheriff Miller's office. Beyond these lay scattered homes and farms, with the snow-capped mountains watching over it all like ancient guardians. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor Blackwood's farm sat 1.5 miles west of town, balanced perfectly between privacy and convenience. The 2-story cabin Thomas had built with his own hands stood surrounded by fertile fields, an apple orchard just coming into bloom, and a bubbling creek that never ran dry. The afternoon following the unwelcome visitors found Eleanor in town, completing her regular Saturday deliveries. Her butter and preserves were Silver Pine's prized commodities, coveted even by the hotel's demanding cook. "These blackberry preserves might be your best yet, Eleanor," Martha Dawson said, arranging the jars on the general store's shelf. Martha and her husband had owned the store since Silver Pine was nothing more than a handful of hopeful settlers. "Was Hannah feeling better?" "Missed her at the social last Sunday." "Just a spring cold," Eleanor replied, carefully selecting coffee beans. "From Martha's stock. She's helping the Parkers with their lambing today." Sheriff Miller entered, the bell above the door announcing his arrival. At 50-something, James Miller was as much a fixture in Silver Pine as the mountains themselves, steady, reliable, and not easily moved. His badge shone against his worn vest as he nodded respectfully. "Mrs. Blackwood, Mrs. Dawson," he greeted them. "Fine day." Eleanor nodded in return, noting the unusual tension in the sheriff's posture. The visit from the 3 riders clearly wasn't sitting well with him either. "Heard you had some visitors yesterday, Eleanor," Sheriff Miller said, confirming her suspicions. In small towns, news traveled fast as telegrams. Strangers, 3 men. "Word travels quickly," Eleanor commented, measuring coffee into a paper bag with precise movements. "Colton Parker saw them leaving your property, said they didn't look like friendly callers." The sheriff studied her face. "Everything all right out there?" Eleanor considered her response carefully. James Miller was a good man, a fair lawman, but even good men sometimes viewed women as delicate creatures needing protection. The last thing she needed was well-intentioned interference. "Just some men interested in buying land. I declined their offer." Martha leaned forward over the counter. "Were they the same ones who've been asking questions at the saloon?" Burke mentioned. "Some rough types drinking there 3 nights running, asking about property boundaries and such." Sheriff Miller nodded. That'd be them, led by a fellow named Hawkins, Jared Hawkins. He watched Eleanor's face as he spoke the name, looking for recognition. You know him. Never met him before yesterday, Eleanor replied truthfully. And she hadn't, though the name stirred something in her memory, some connection she couldn't quite place. Well, I've got telegrams from Fort Collins and Denver, Sheriff Miller continued. Seems Mr. Hawkins and his associates have a habit of acquiring land through methods that don't always align with the law. Railroads coming through these parts next year, and certain properties suddenly become mighty valuable, like land with natural passes through the mountains, Eleanor observed. The sheriff's eyes sharpened. Exactly like that. Your property sits right at the easternmost approach to McClintock Pass. Martha made a small sound of concern. Eleanor, you don't think they'd... They're welcome to try, Eleanor cut in, her voice calm but firm. My land isn't for sale, not at any price. The conversation shifted to other matters. Spring planting, the church social, Judge Harmon's upcoming circuit visit, but Eleanor felt Sheriff Miller's gaze following her as she completed her purchases. He was a good lawman, observant enough to sense something beneath her composed exterior. I'll walk you to your wagon, Mrs. Blackwood, he offered as she prepared to leave. Outside, with Main Street's modest bustle providing privacy and noise, the sheriff spoke directly. Those men, Hawkins especially, they're not the type to take no for an answer. Been reports of fires, accidents, all manner of misfortune befalling folks who stood in their way. Eleanor secured her purchases in the wagon. Are you suggesting I sell my home to criminals, Sheriff? No, ma'am, Miller replied quickly. Just suggesting caution. Maybe send Hannah to stay with relatives for a spell until this blows over. Hannah has no relatives but me, Eleanor said, her voice softening slightly at the genuine concern in the sheriff's weathered face. But I appreciate your concern. She climbed onto the wagon seat with practiced ease, gathering the reins. Sheriff Miller placed a hand on the wagon's edge, holding her gaze. There's something else, he said, lowering his voice. Hawkins was asking particular questions about you, not just your land. Eleanor's hands stilled on the reins. What kind of questions? Where you came from before Silver Pine, whether you had any unusual skills. The sheriff's eyes held a question he wasn't quite asking. Said he'd heard stories about a widow from these parts. A chill that had nothing to do with the spring. Breeze settled over Eleanor. People love their stories, Sheriff, she said evenly, especially about widows living alone. Sheriff Miller nodded slowly, not entirely convinced. Just be careful, Eleanor. I'll keep an eye on Hawkins and his men when they're in town, but my jurisdiction only stretches so far. I've been taking care of myself and Hannah for a long time, she replied. We'll be fine. As Eleanor drove the wagon down Main Street toward home, her mind worked through the new information. Hawkins knew something, or suspected something, about her past. The question was, how much? And more importantly, how far was he willing to go to get what he wanted? The road home wound through budding aspen groves, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the afternoon light. Eleanor allowed the familiar landscape to calm her thoughts, organizing what she knew and what she needed to do. Hawkins wanted her land for its strategic position, likely for ambushing the coming railroad. Her refusal had already triggered threats, veiled but unmistakable, and now it seemed he might be using her past as additional leverage. As the wagon crested the final hill before her property, Eleanor saw Hannah in the distance, riding back from the Parkers' farm. Her daughter's easy grace in the saddle brought a momentary smile to Eleanor's face. Thomas had taught Hannah to ride before she could properly walk, and the girl had inherited her father's natural way with horses. Eleanor's smile faded as she considered what might lie ahead. For 7 years, she'd sheltered Hannah from the whispers and stares that had followed Midnight Eleanor across the territories. She'd created this peaceful existence precisely to give her daughter the normal life that had been denied to her. Now, that carefully constructed peace was threatened, not just by men wanting her land, but by the possible exposure of her past. If Hawkins revealed what he knew or thought he knew, how would Hannah react to discovering her mother's hidden identity? How would the good people of Silver Pine treat them? The wagon rolled into the yard just as Hannah dismounted. The girls' cheeks were flushed with exertion and excitement. "Mama! Mrs. Parker says they're best you had triplets. Imagine that, 3 lambs, all healthy." Hannah's smile faltered as she noticed her mother's expression. "What's wrong?" Eleanor forced a reassuring smile. "Nothing to worry about, honey. Just tired from town. How about you start supper while I tend to the horses?" As Hannah headed inside, Eleanor unhitched the wagon with efficient movements, her mind still working through contingencies. The obvious solution, selling the land and moving elsewhere, wasn't truly an option. This was Thomas's land, the home he'd built for them, Hannah's inheritance. Besides, Eleanor had learned long ago that running from threats only invited pursuit. The barn's shadowy interior, Eleanor led the horses to their stalls, her movements automatic as her thoughts churned. The barn was her domain, a place where even Hannah rarely ventured beyond feeding the chickens and collecting eggs. Here, Eleanor maintained certain skills in privacy, away from curious eyes. At the back of the barn, behind bales of hay and old equipment, lay a hidden compartment in the wall. Eleanor slid the concealed panel aside, revealing a small, dusty space containing items from her previous life that she couldn't bear to leave behind completely. A worn leather rifle case, a set of specialized tools for bullet crafting, and most precious of all, a small wooden box containing the special bullets she'd designed herself, bullets with distinct internal chambers that created an unmistakable whistling sound in flight. Her singing bullets, they'd been called. Eleanor's signature. No other hunter or tracker had ever replicated them successfully. Eleanor closed the panel without removing anything. Not yet. But knowing these remnants of her past were still accessible brought a certain comfort in the face of mounting threats. She understood men like Hawkins, predators who mistook quiet dignity for weakness, who targeted those they believed couldn't fight back. 7 years ago, she would have handled such threats directly, with the skills that had made her famous. Now, with Hannah to consider, with the life they'd built here, the path forward wasn't so clear. As darkness settled over Silver Pine Valley and the first stars appeared above the mountains, Eleanor stood on her porch, watching the night deepen. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing across the valley floor. Eleanor found herself unconsciously calculating distance and direction from sound alone, an old skill, never truly forgotten. Inside, Hannah was already asleep, her dreams undisturbed by the concerns weighing on her mother. For now, at least, peace remained within their home. But Eleanor knew better than most how quickly peace could shatter. Tomorrow, she decided, she would need to begin preparations. Not obvious ones that would alarm Hannah or attract attention, but the small, crucial readiness measures that had once been second nature to her. Just in case, Hawkins and his men decided that threats alone weren't enough to get what they wanted. The Silver Pine saloon hummed with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Unlike the rowdy establishments of larger frontier towns, this one maintained a certain respectability, a place where miners, farmers, and businessmen could enjoy a drink without fearing for their safety. This made the 3 strangers at the corner table all the more conspicuous. Jared. Hawkins sat with his back to the wall, a position that afforded him a clear view of both the batwing doors and the bar. His face, marked by a jagged scar running from temple to jaw, remained expressionless as he nursed his whiskey. To his right sat Vince Decker, a wiry man with quick eyes and quicker fingers, well known among certain circles for his skill with locks and safes. On Hawkins's left lounged the biggest of the three, Samuel Reed, whose massive hands could crush a man's windpipe as easily as they now crushed a playing card into his palm. "Boss, we've been here 3 days," Reed muttered, his voice surprisingly soft for his size. "When are we making our move?" Hawkins didn't immediately respond, his gaze fixed on the saloon's other patrons. Finally, he spoke just loudly enough for his companions to hear. "Patience, Sam. You can't rush a proper acquisition." Decker snorted. "Is that what we're calling it now?" "That land is worth 10 times what any of these farmers realize," Hawkins replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "The railroad survey confirmed it last month. McClintock Pass will be the primary route through these mountains, and whoever controls the eastern approach controls the pass. And the widow ain't selling," Reed pointed out. A thin smile touched Hawkins's scarred face. "Few do at first." The saloon doors swung open, admitting Sheriff Miller. The lawman's gaze immediately found the 3 men, his expression hardening, almost imperceptibly as he made his way to the bar. "Our friend the sheriff's taking quite an interest in us," Decker observed, absently shuffling a deck of cards with one hand. "Let him," Hawkins replied. "Makes things more interesting." The door opened again, this time revealing a slender man in a dusty riding coat. His unremarkable appearance allowed him to pass unnoticed through the room until he reached their table. Without invitation, he pulled up a chair. "Took you long enough, Cooper," Hawkins said, not bothering to lower his voice now. Frank Cooper, the newest addition to Hawkins' operation, had spent the past week traveling through neighboring counties, gathering information. Unlike the others, his value lay not in violence, but in knowledge, specifically the kind acquired through careful research and well-placed bribes. "Had to be thorough," Cooper replied, signaling the barkeep for a drink. "And I found something that might interest you regarding our reluctant widow." This caught Hawkins' full attention. "Go on." Cooper glanced toward the sheriff, then lowered his voice. "Ever hear of Midnight Eleanor?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Hawkins's eyes narrowed with recognition. "The buffalo hunter? The one they claimed could shoot blindfolded?" Cooper nodded, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. "One and the same. And I've got reason to believe our Mrs. Blackwood is her." Reed looked skeptical. "That's just trail talk. No woman could do what they said she did." "Oh, it's real enough," Cooper countered, accepting his whiskey from the barmaid. "I traced records through Wyoming, Kansas, the Dakotas, found old newspaper, articles, testimonials, even tracked down a fellow who swore he'd seen her exhibition shooting in Cheyenne, said she could hit targets while blindfolded that most men couldn't hit with both eyes open and a steady hand." Hawkins leaned forward, his interest visibly piqued. "And you're certain it's our widow?" "Descriptions match. Timeline fits." "Eleanor Blackwood disappeared from the circuit about 7 years back, right around when our widow showed up here with a young girl. Plus," Cooper added, lowering his voice further, "I found this in the Denver newspaper archives." He slid a folded paper across the table. Hawkins opened it carefully, revealing a yellowed clipping with a sketch of a woman holding a Sharps rifle. Though younger, the resemblance to Eleanor Blackwood was unmistakable. "Well now," Hawkins murmured, studying the image. "Isn't that interesting?" Decker peered at the clipping. "So what? She was some fancy shot years ago. She's just a butter-churning widow now." "You're missing the point," Hawkins said carefully, refolding the paper. "This gives us leverage. Every person in this town has secrets they'd rather keep buried, but few have secrets this valuable." Reed frowned. "I don't follow." "People around here see her as just Widow Blackwood. Respectable, quiet, makes good preserves," Hawkins explained with exaggerated patience. How do you think they'd react to learning she made her living as a traveling exhibition shooter, that she hunted with Pawnee trackers, that she lived like a man among men before settling here? Understanding dawned on Reed's face. They'd turn on her. Small towns like this run on reputation, Cooper confirmed. A woman like that, living outside society's bounds, doing things women aren't supposed to do, she'd be ostracized. Her and her daughter both. Hawkins nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. And that, gentlemen, is how you acquire property without firing a single shot. Across the saloon, Sheriff Miller finished his drink and departed, casting one final glance toward their table. Hawkins waited until the door closed behind him before continuing. That's our first approach. Threaten to expose her past unless she sells. Clean, simple. And if that doesn't work? Decker asked. Hawkins' expression hardened. Then we move to more direct methods. After all, a widow living alone with her daughter, all sorts of accidents could happen. A barn fire, spooked horses, a fall down a steep ravine. Or maybe something happens to the girl, Reed suggested, his huge hands folding into fists. Most mothers will do anything to protect their children. Hawkins considered this, tapping one finger against his glass. The daughter could be useful, but let's try the civilized approach first. I'll pay Mrs. Blackwood another visit tomorrow, alone. You sure that's wise, boss? Cooper asked. If she really is who I think she is. She's a middle-aged widow who hasn't touched a rifle in 7 years, Hawkins cut in. I'm not concerned. As the men continued their planning, they failed to notice young Tommy Parker at a nearby table, ostensibly playing checkers with his friend, but listening intently to every word. At 13, Tommy was often overlooked by adults, a fact that had made him an excellent source of town gossip. But what he'd just overheard went beyond gossip. These men were plotting something dangerous against Mrs. Blackwood and Hannah. The minute the conversation shifted to other topics, Tommy whispered an excuse to his friend and slipped out of the saloon. He needed to find Sheriff Miller immediately. Meanwhile, at the Blackwood farm, Eleanor stood in her bedroom before the chest she'd finally unlocked. Inside lay the vestiges of her former life, carefully preserved despite her determination to leave that life behind. Her fingers traced the smooth leather of her shooting gloves, the polished grips of a Remington revolver she'd kept despite selling her prized Sharps rifle. At the bottom of the chest lay her most treasured possession, a black silk bandana, worn, thin from years of use. The blindfold that had made her famous. Eleanor lifted it carefully, allowing the silk to slide through her fingers. How many times had she tied this across her eyes, relying on her other senses to guide her shots? How many skeptical onlookers had gasped when she hit targets she couldn't possibly see? The skill hadn't come naturally. Like everything in her life, it had been hard-earned through years of relentless practice. After losing her eyesight temporarily following a hunting accident at 20, Eleanor had been forced to develop her other senses to compensate. Even after her vision returned, she continued the practice, discovering that her shooting actually improved when she relied on hearing, smell, and her innate awareness of spatial relationships. What had begun as compensation for injury had become her signature skill, the ability to track and shoot while completely blindfolded. Promoters had capitalized on it, billing her as Midnight Eleanor, the woman who sees without eyes. The spectacle had drawn crowds across the frontier, earning her both fame and the money she'd needed after her first husband's death left her with a young daughter and mounting debts. Eleanor returned the blindfold to the chest with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. Those skills had saved her once. They might be needed again. The sound of a horse approaching at speed pulled her from her reverie. Eleanor quickly closed the chest, sliding it back under her bed before moving to the window. Through the gathering dusk, she recognized Sheriff Miller's bay gelding galloping up the road toward her property, the rider leaning forward with urgency. Eleanor's stomach tightened with foreboding. Sheriff Miller wasn't one for dramatic entrances or unnecessary haste. If he was riding like that, something was very wrong. She hurried downstairs, reaching the porch just as the sheriff reined his horse to a stop in her yard. The animal's flanks were dark with sweat, its nostrils flaring. "Sheriff," Eleanor called, moving down the steps. "What's happened?" Miller dismounted quickly, removing his hat. "Is Hannah here with you?" The question sent ice through Eleanor's veins. "She rode to the Wilsons' place to deliver eggs about an hour ago. Should be back any time now. Why?" The sheriff's grave expression told her everything she needed to know before he even spoke. "Tommy Parker overheard something in the saloon. Hawkins and his men. They're planning to use your past as leverage to force you to sell, and if that doesn't work—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "They mentioned harming Hannah," Eleanor finished for him, her voice suddenly hollow. Sheriff Miller nodded grimly. "I've already sent deputies to find her, escort her home safely." But even as he spoke, Eleanor's attention had shifted to the distant ridge, where a plume of dust marked an approaching rider, too small to be Hannah on her mare. As the figure drew closer, Eleanor recognized young Billy Wilson, the blacksmith's son, riding as if the devil himself were on his heels. The boy, nearly, fell from his horse in his haste to reach them, his face pale with fear and exertion. "Mrs. Blackwood," he gasped. "They took her. Those men, they took Hannah." "Where?" Eleanor's voice cut through the air like a blade. All trace of the gentle widow vanished. "Where did they take her?" Billy Wilson gulped, clearly startled by the transformation in Mrs. Blackwood's demeanor. Gone was the soft-spoken baker of apple pies and maker of preserves. In her place stood a woman with eyes sharp as flint and a spine like tempered steel. "Old Mitchell's mine," the boy stammered. I was riding home from my uncle's place when I saw them, 3 men forcing Hannah up the North Trail. I recognized one as that fellow with the scar who's been hanging around town." Sheriff Miller's hand moved instinctively to his pistol. "How long ago?" "Maybe 20 minutes. I came straight here after seeing which way they were headed." Eleanor was already moving toward the house with purposeful strides. "Sheriff, gather whatever men you can. Meet me at the base of North Ridge in 30 minutes. Miller followed her, concern etched across his weathered face. "Eleanor, wait. These men are dangerous. We need to approach this carefully." She turned to face him, and something in her expression made him fall silent. "Every minute we delay is another minute my daughter is in their hands. I'm not waiting." Inside, Eleanor moved with mechanical efficiency, her mind racing through calculations and possibilities, while her body operated on pure muscle memory. From beneath her bed, she pulled out the chest again, this time removing its contents with deliberate purpose. The Remington revolver, ammunition, the leather gloves. After a moment's hesitation, she also took the black silk blindfold, tucking it into her pocket, not because she planned to use it, that would be foolish under these circumstances, but as a reminder of who she had been, who she might need to become again. Eleanor changed quickly into riding clothes that had remained untouched for years. Sturdy canvas trousers, a leather vest over a cotton shirt, and well-worn boots that had once carried her across thousands of miles of prairie. The clothing felt both foreign and familiar against her skin, like greeting an old friend whose face had begun to fade from memory. In the barn, she saddled her gelding Thunder with swift, practiced movements. The horse sensed her urgency, standing perfectly still as she secured her gear. Eleanor strapped a Winchester repeating rifle to the saddle. Not her preferred Sharps, which she'd sold years ago, but a reliable weapon nonetheless. As she worked, a voice called from outside the barn. "Mrs. Blackwood." Eleanor emerged to find Martha Dawson from the general store, her husband's shotgun clutched in her hands. Behind her stood Tom Wilson, the blacksmith, and Robert Parker, both armed and mounted. "Sheriff Miller sent word," Martha explained. "Said, these men have taken Hannah." Eleanor nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement. "I'm heading to Mitchell's mine." "We're coming with you," Robert Parker stated firmly. "Hannah tutors my boys twice a week, helps them with their letters. No, one touches one of our own." For a brief moment, emotion threatened to overwhelm Eleanor. Not fear for Hannah, which burned cold and clear in her veins, but gratitude for these people who had accepted her and her daughter as part of their community. She mastered it quickly, focusing on the task at hand. "Thank you," she said simply, mounting thunder with a fluid motion that betrayed years of practice. "But understand, these men won't hesitate to kill. If you come, follow my lead." The small group exchanged looks of surprise at her authoritative tone, but nodded agreement. Whatever questions they might have had about the widow's sudden transformation were secondary to the urgency of rescuing Hannah. They rode hard, taking the narrow trail that wound up toward North Ridge, where the abandoned Mitchell mine cut into the mountainside. The old silver mine had been played out years before Eleanor arrived in Silver Pine, but its tunnels and buildings remained, occasionally used by passing trappers, or, in this case, men with darker purposes. As they approached, Eleanor signaled for them to stop in a stand of pines that offered concealment. The mine entrance was visible about 200 yards ahead, its weathered timbers stark against the mountainside. A lantern glowed faintly from within the entrance, and 2 horses were tethered outside. 2 horses, but Billy said there were 3 men, Eleanor observed, her voice low. "One must be inside with Hannah, the others could be on watch." Tom Wilson squinted toward the mine. "Can't see anyone outside. Doesn't mean they're not there," Eleanor replied. She studied the terrain with the practiced eye of someone who had once tracked games across far more difficult landscapes. There, behind that rock outcropping to the west of the entrance, someone's positioned there. The others followed her, gaze, but saw nothing until, moments later, a faint glint of metal caught the fading light as someone shifted position. Martha's expression was a mixture of surprise and newfound respect. "How did you experience?" Eleanor cut her off. She turned to Robert Parker. "I need you to circle around to the east, create a distraction, something loud enough to draw attention but far enough away that they'll have to investigate." Parker nodded. "I can manage that." "Mr. Wilson, you and Mrs. Dawson stay here. If anyone comes out of that mine who isn't me or Hannah, use that shotgun." Eleanor dismounted, securing Thunder to a sturdy pine. From her saddlebag, she retrieved something the others didn't recognize: the specialized bullets she'd crafted years ago with their distinct internal chambers. She loaded them carefully into the Winchester. "Mrs. Blackwood," Martha began hesitantly, "have you done this sort of thing before?" A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips. "In another life." As Parker rode off to create his diversion, Eleanor moved through the underbrush with a stealth that would have impressed even the Pawnee trackers who had once taught her their ways. She became a shadow among shadows, her footfalls silent on the rocky ground, her breathing controlled and even. The skills she'd honed, hunting buffalo, patience, awareness, precision, served her now as she advanced toward the mine. Every sense was heightened. She could smell the horses, hear the subtle shift of weight as the hidden guard adjusted his position, and feel the change in air currents that suggested an opening nearby. When she was within 50 yards of the lookout's position, Robert Parker's diversion came, the crack of a rifle, followed by the crash of a felled tree branch some distance to the east. As expected, the guard's attention immediately turned toward the sound. Eleanor used the moment to close the distance, moving swiftly until she was directly behind him. The man, Decker, she recognized from their earlier encounter, was focused. entirely on the direction of the noise, his rifle ready. "Don't move," Eleanor said quietly, pressing the barrel of her Winchester against his spine. Decker froze, then slowly began to turn his head. "I said don't move," she repeated, her voice carrying an authority that stopped him instantly. "Where is my daughter?" "Inside," Decker replied, a slight tremor in his voice betraying his surprise at being caught unawares. "With Hawkins." "How many others?" "Just Reed. He's patrolling the perimeter." Decker hesitated, then added with growing confidence, "You're making a mistake, lady. You can't take all of us." Eleanor applied slightly more pressure with the rifle barrel. "I've taken down buffalo bulls, charging at full speed. 3 men with guns don't concern me overmuch." Something in her tone, the cold certainty of it, made Decker stiffen. "You're her, aren't you? The one Cooper told us about, Midnight Eleanor." She didn't answer directly. "Your rifle, drop it slowly." He complied, the weapon clattering against the rocky ground. "Now your sidearm, 2 fingers only." Again Decker obeyed, carefully removing his revolver and placing it on the ground. "Hands behind your back." As he moved to comply, Decker suddenly lunged sideways, rolling away from the rifle and drawing a hidden knife from his boot in one fluid motion. The attack was fast, but Eleanor's response was faster. She sidestepped his wild slash, the blade passing harmlessly through empty air where she had stood a split second before. Before Decker could recover his balance, Eleanor struck him with the rifle butt in a precise blow to the temple. He crumpled instantly, unconscious but alive. Using strips torn from Decker's own bandana, Eleanor bound his hands and feet with the efficiency of someone who had once prepared dozens of game animals for transport. She dragged him into the underbrush, concealing him from immediate view. Only then did she pause, listening intently for any sign that the brief scuffle had been detected. The night remained quiet, except for the normal sounds of the wilderness, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind through pine needles. Eleanor retrieved Decker's weapons, tucking the revolver into her belt as a backup. She then continued, her approach toward the mine entrance moving from shadow to shadow with predatory grace. 20 yards from the entrance, she paused again, this time to listen for voices from within. The acoustics of the mountainside carried faint sounds to her. "Trained ear, 2 men talking, one of them Hawkins." And there, barely audible but unmistakable to a mother's ear, Hannah's voice, tense but unharmed. Relief flooded through Eleanor, quickly replaced by cold focus. 1 guard down, 2 men remaining inside with Hannah. And somewhere out there, Reed was still patrolling. As if summoned by her thoughts, a massive shadow detached itself from the darkness to her left. Reed, returning from his perimeter check. Eleanor froze, becoming one with the boulder that partially concealed her. The big man passed within 10 feet of her position without noticing her presence, his attention focused on the mine entrance. Eleanor waited until he was past before raising. Her Winchester, one well-placed shot, now could eliminate half of the remaining threat. Her finger tensed on the trigger, but Reed was moving directly toward the mine entrance. A shot now would alert Hawkins inside, potentially putting Hannah in. Immediate danger. Eleanor lowered the rifle, choosing patience over immediate action. She would need to deal with both remaining men simultaneously or find a way to separate them from Hannah. As Reed disappeared into the mine entrance, Eleanor advanced to the edge of the clearing. The moment of confrontation was approaching, and with it a decision. How much of Midnight Eleanor would she need to become to save her daughter? The abandoned Mitchell mine had once bustled with the sound of pickaxes and the hopes of men seeking silver. Now its tunnels echoed with a different kind of tension, the cold calculation of kidnappers and the quiet terror of their victim. Inside the mine's main chamber, Hannah Blackwood sat against the rough-hewn wall, her wrists bound before her, her eyes darting between her captors with a mixture of fear and defiance. A lantern cast shifting shadows across the space, illuminating Jared Hawkins as he paced the dirt floor like a caged predator. "Your mother's taking her time," Hawkins remarked, checking the pocket watch he'd been consulting with increasing frequency. "Perhaps she doesn't value you as much as we thought." Hannah's chin lifted, a gesture unconsciously mirroring her mother's characteristic pride. "She'll come. And when she does, you'll regret taking me." Hawkins laughed, the sound bouncing hollowly off the stone walls. "Such confidence, just like your mother." He crouched before her, studying her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Tell me, did she ever mention her life before Silver Pine? The things she was capable of?" Before Hannah could respond, heavy footsteps announced Reed's arrival. The massive man had to duck to enter the chamber. "Decker's not at his post," Reed reported, his brow furrowed with concern. "No sign of him anywhere." Hawkins straightened, his hand moving instinctively to his holstered revolver. "Check again. Wider perimeter this time." "Already did," Reed insisted. "Something's not right, and I thought I heard movement near the west slope." A flicker of unease crossed Hawkins' face, quickly replaced by determination. The widow's making her move sooner than expected. He turned to Hannah, grabbing her arm and pulling her roughly to her feet. "Time for you to be useful." Outside, Eleanor pressed herself against the rough timber frame of the mine entrance, listening to the exchange. Her jaw tightened at Hawkins' treatment of Hannah, but she maintained her disciplined stillness. Rushing in would endanger her daughter. She needed to be strategic, patient, qualities that had made her deadly in her previous life. Eleanor calculated her options with the precision that had once allowed her to track and hunt the most elusive game. The mine had two entrances, this main one and a smaller air shaft about 50 yards up the hillside. If she could create a distraction at one entrance while entering through the other, her planning was interrupted by movement from inside. Footsteps approached the entrance, multiple sets. Eleanor melted back into the shadows just as Hawkins emerged, dragging Hannah before him with a gun pressed to her ribs. Reed followed, his massive form blocking much of the entrance as he scanned the surrounding area with wary eyes. "I know you're out there, Mrs. Blackwood," Hawkins called into the darkness. "Show yourself, or your daughter pays the price for your stubbornness." Eleanor's heart constricted at the sight of Hannah, her brave girl trying to maintain composure despite the fear evident in her eyes. Their gazes met briefly across the clearing, and Eleanor saw her daughter's expression shift from fear to something like wonder as she took in her mother's transformed appearance. 10 seconds, Mrs. Blackwood," Hawkins continued, pressing the gun more firmly against Hannah's side. 10, 9... Eleanor's mind raced. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation with Hannah as a hostage, nor could she allow Hawkins to maintain control of the situation. 8, 7... An old buffalo hunting strategy flashed through her. Mind, the way to separate a dangerous bull from the herd. Create confusion, apply pressure at the right point, control the direction of movement. 6, 5... Her decision was made. Eleanor raised her Winchester and fired a single shot. Not at Hawkins or Reed, but at the lantern Hawkins had placed on a rock beside the entrance. The specialized bullet emitted its distinctive whistle. As it flew, a sound unlike any conventional shot, the lantern exploded in a shower of glass and burning oil, momentarily blinding all three figures by the entrance. In the sudden chaos, Eleanor was already moving, circling to approach from a new angle. "What the hell was that?" Reed shouted, drawing his pistol and firing blindly into the darkness. "Hold your fire, you fool," Hawkins snarled, maintaining his grip on Hannah despite the confusion. "That sound, did you hear it?" Eleanor fired again. Another whistling bullet that ricocheted off the rocks behind them, creating the impression that shots were coming from multiple directions. The distinctive sound of her specialized ammunition, her singing bullets as they'd once been known, filled the night air like eerie music. "It's her," Hawkins realized, his voice tinged with dawning comprehension and a hint of fear. It really is midnight, Eleanor. Eleanor emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, her Winchester leveled, her stance balanced and sure. "Let my daughter go, Hawkins." The outlaw leader's eyes widened as he took in her appearance. So different from the widow he'd confronted days before. In place of the demure homemaker stood a frontier legend, her presence commanding the very air around her. "Well now," Hawkins said, regaining his composure, "the famous Midnight Eleanor reveals herself at last. I suspected, but seeing is believing." "This is between you and me," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the rage building within her. "Release Hannah, and perhaps you walk away from this." Hawkins laughed, though the sound lacked conviction. "You're not in a position to make demands." He nodded toward Reed, who raised his pistol. "Even you can't shoot both of us before one of us shoots her." Eleanor's eyes never left Hawkins, but her awareness encompassed the entire scene. Reed's position, Hannah's tense posture, the distance between them, the direction of the wind, the subtle sounds of the night. Information flooded her senses, processed with the speed and precision that had once made her famous. "You've researched me enough to know who I am," she said calmly. "Then you should also know what I'm capable of." Something in her tone made Reed shift uneasily. "Boss, maybe we should—" "Shut up," Hawkins snapped. To Eleanor he said, "I know the stories, exaggerated like all legends. Are they?" Eleanor countered. She slowly, deliberately reached into her pocket and withdrew the black silk blindfold. "Perhaps a demonstration is in order." The gesture had its intended effect. Hawkins' eyes, fixed on the blindfold, momentarily distracted by the physical evidence of her legendary skills. In that split second of divided attention, Eleanor made her move. Her first shot whistled through the air with its distinctive sound, striking Reed's gun with pinpoint accuracy and sending it spinning from his grasp. Before the echo faded, her second shot clipped the brim of Hawkins' hat, a warning so precise it couldn't be mistaken for anything but intentional restraint. Reed staggered back, clutching his stinging hand and staring at Eleanor with newfound terror. "She shot the gun right out of my hand, just like they said she could." Hawkins, however, maintained his grip on Hannah, his own weapon still pressed against her. "Impressive," he acknowledged, recovering quickly. "But unless you can shoot around corners, Mrs. Blackwood, we remain at an impasse." Eleanor lowered her Winchester slightly, her expression unchanging. "You're right. I can't shoot around corners." A beat of silence. "But I don't need to." From behind Hawkins came the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked. Martha Dawson's voice rang out, steady and determined. "Let the girl go, mister, or I'll blow a hole in you big enough to toss a cat through." Hawkins froze, realizing, too late, that he'd been outmaneuvered. While Eleanor had commanded his attention at the front, Martha had circled around, using the confusion of the shooting to approach from behind. Eleanor smiled thinly. "Buffalo hunting teaches you many things, Mr. Hawkins. The importance of terrain, the value of patience, and above all, the necessity of cooperative hunting when facing dangerous prey." Trapped between Eleanor's legendary marksmanship and Martha's shotgun, Hawkins seemed to deflate. His eyes darted around, seeking escape and finding none. For a moment, tension hung in the air like a physical presence, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. Then, with deliberate slowness, Hawkins released his grip on Hannah and raised his hands. "It seems the stories about you weren't exaggerated. After all." Hannah immediately pulled away from him, running to her mother's side. Eleanor wrapped one arm around her daughter protectively, her Winchester never wavering from its aim at Hawkins's chest. "Mr. Wilson, Mr. Parker," Eleanor called out. "You can join us now." The blacksmith and farmer emerged from their hidden positions, rifles trained on the outlaws. Tom Wilson quickly secured Reed with rope from his saddlebag, while Robert Parker collected the discarded weapons. Throughout it all, Hannah stared at her mother with wide, disbelieving eyes. This woman, confident, commanding, dangerously competent, was almost unrecognizable as the gentle widow who had raised her. "Mama," she whispered, voice barely audible, "what is happening? How did you... Who are you?" The question struck Eleanor like a physical blow. This moment, the collision of her past and present, the revelation of her true self to her daughter, was what she had feared for 7 years. The reason she had buried Midnight Eleanor so deeply. "Later, honey," she murmured, squeezing Hannah's shoulder gently. "I promise I'll explain everything." Sheriff Miller arrived with his deputies minutes later, having followed the sound of gunfire up the mountain trail. He took in the scene, the bound outlaws, the armed townspeople, and Eleanor. Blackwood transformed from widow to legend before his eyes. "It appears I missed quite a confrontation," he observed, dismounting. Eleanor nodded, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders. "These men kidnapped my daughter, Sheriff, attempted to force me to sell my land through threats and violence. Miller's deputies took charge of Hawkins and Reed, securing them for transport to the jail in town. As they led the men away, Hawkins twisted to look back at Eleanor, his expression a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "You know this isn't over," he called. "Cooper's still out there, and once word spreads about who you really are." "What? You really are? These fine townspeople might not be so eager to stand beside you." Martha Dawson stepped forward, shotgun still clutched firmly in her hands. "You let us worry about that, mister. Silver Pine takes care of its own." As Hawkins and Reed were led away, Eleanor found herself surrounded by the small group who had come to her aid, ordinary townspeople who had risked their lives to help rescue Hannah. Yet even amid their congratulations and expressions of relief, Eleanor could see questions forming in their eyes. Questions about who she really was, questions she'd spent 7 years avoiding. But the most important questions would come from Hannah, who stood beside her mother with 1,000 unspoken words hanging between them. The young woman's expression was a complex mixture of relief, confusion, wonder, and something that might have been hurt. "Mama," Hannah said softly, once the others had moved a short distance away to prepare for the journey back to town. "Those things he said about you, about Midnight Eleanor, is it true?" Eleanor looked into her daughter's eyes, so like her own, observant and intelligent, and knew the time for secrets had passed. The careful wall she'd built between her past and present had crumbled tonight as surely as if it had been struck by a physical blow. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's true, all of it." Hannah absorbed this, her brow furrowing. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The simple question held layers of hurt and confusion. Eleanor reached out, gently touching her daughter's cheek in a gesture of tenderness at odds with the skilled hunter who had just disabled 2 armed men without breaking a sweat. "I wanted to protect you from that life," she explained. "From the stars, the whispers, the judgment. I wanted you to have a normal childhood, not be known as the daughter of—" She hesitated, then finished, "of a spectacle." Hannah's gaze dropped to the black silk blindfold still clutched in Eleanor's hand. "Could you really shoot blindfolded? Hunt buffalo without seeing?" "I could. I can." Eleanor glanced at the curious onlookers, now pretending not to listen. "It's not something I wanted to know here. It's not the life I chose for us. But it's who you are," Hannah said with a wisdom beyond her 17 years. "Who you've always been, even when you were pretending to be someone else." The words struck Eleanor profoundly. For 7 years, she had viewed her past as something shameful to be hidden, a secret to protect Hannah from. But in her daughter's eyes, she saw not judgment, but a hunger to understand, to know the truth of her mother's life. Before Eleanor could respond, Sheriff Miller approached, his expression grave. "We should head back to town. There's still Cooper, unaccounted for, and I don't like leaving loose ends." Eleanor nodded, tucking the blindfold back into her pocket. The confrontation with Hawkins might be over, but she sensed this was just the beginning of a larger reckoning, with her past, with her daughter, and with the life she had built in Silver Pine. As they mounted their horses for the ride back to town, Eleanor caught Martha Dawson studying her with new eyes. "Midnight, Eleanor," Martha said quietly. "I heard stories about you years back. Never made the connection." Eleanor braced herself for judgment, for the change in attitude she had feared for so long. Instead, Martha simply nodded. "Explains a lot. That jam you make. Always wondered how you got it so precise every time. Turns out you've got the steadiest hands in 6 territories." The unexpected acceptance, the simple way Martha incorporated this new knowledge without allowing it to erase 7 years of friendship, brought a lump to Eleanor's throat. As they rode down the mountain trail under a canopy of stars, Eleanor Blackwood found herself suspended between 2 identities, the widow she had pretended to be and the legend she had once been. Which would emerge dominant in the days to come remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: there was no going back to the careful separation she had maintained for so long. The past and present had collided tonight on this mountainside, and, from that collision, a new future would have to be forged. Dawn broke over Silver Pine with unusual commotion. The jail rarely housed more than the occasional drunk or rowdy cowhand, but today it contained Jared Hawkins and his men, their presence drawing curious onlookers like moths to flame. The story of the midnight confrontation at Mitchell's mine had spread through town with astonishing speed, growing more elaborate with each telling, but it wasn't just the thwarted kidnapping that had tongues wagging. It was the revelation about Eleanor Blackwood, the quiet widow who made exceptional preserves and kept to herself, being none other than the legendary Midnight Eleanor, a woman whose shooting exhibitions and blindfolded hunting had once been the talk of the Western Territories. In the sheriff's office, Eleanor sat across from James Miller, her posture straight, her face composed, despite the exhaustion evident in the shadows beneath her eyes. Hannah dozed in a chair nearby, finally succumbing to fatigue after the night's ordeal. "Cooper's still out there," Sheriff Miller said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking the girl. "And he's the brains of their operation, the one who dug up your past." Eleanor nodded, absently running her thumb over the worn edges of the black silk blindfold she'd placed on the desk between them. "He'll come for Hawkins. Men like that, they're loyal to whoever pays them. Or he might cut his losses, disappear," Miller suggested. "Either way, this isn't over." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It isn't." She glanced toward Hannah, her expression softening momentarily before returning to the sheriff. "But Cooper isn't my only concern. Hawkins was right about one thing. Once word spreads about who I really am, things will change." Miller leaned back in his chair, studying her with thoughtful eyes. "You know, when you first came to Silver Pine, I had my suspicions. A widow with no family connections, settling alone in new territory with a young child. It raised questions. I even sent inquiries to contacts back east." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. And nothing came back that concerned me," he replied, with a slight shrug. "Whatever you might have been before, Mrs. Blackwood, for 7 years you've been a model citizen of this town. That counts for something, at least with me." Before Eleanor could respond, the door opened to admit Martha Dawson, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. The general store owner nodded to the sheriff before addressing Eleanor. "Thought you and Hannah could use some breakfast. Must have been quite a night." She placed the basket on the desk, then hesitated, clearly bursting with unasked questions. Eleanor managed a tired smile. "Thank you, Martha, for the food and for last night. Your timing with that shotgun was impeccable." "Been meaning to ask." "About that," Sheriff Miller interjected. How exactly did you coordinate your approach? Seemed mighty precise for an impromptu rescue. Martha and Eleanor exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. Buffalo hunting tactics, Eleanor explained finally. When hunting dangerous game, you never approach alone or from a single direction. You coordinate your movements, control the animal's options. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Hawkins and his men might as well have been predictable bulls for all their tactical awareness. Martha let out a small laugh. Never thought my first shooting lesson would come in the middle of a kidnapping, but she gave clearer instructions in 3 sentences than my late husband managed in 15 years of trying to teach me. The casual mention of Eleanor's expertise seemed to break a dam. Martha pulled up a chair, leaning forward eagerly. Is it true about blindfolded hunting? Tom Wilson's boy is telling everyone you hit a man's gun right out of his hand last night in the dark. Eleanor hesitated. Years of practice secrecy warring with the reality that there was little point in denial now. Yes, she finally admitted. It's true, though somewhat exaggerated in the telling, as these things tend to be. Not from what I saw, came a new voice from the doorway. Robert Parker stood there, hat in hands, his weathered face serious. Saw, you take that shot last night. Never seen anything like it. And in this light, he gestured to the rising sun streaming through the office windows. I'd wager you could hit anything you aimed at. The sheriff rose, recognizing the turn the conversation was taking. Mr. Parker, if you're here about Hawkins and his men, I can assure you they're secure. Not here about them, Parker replied, stepping fully into the office. Here about Cooper. My oldest boy spotted a rider watching the town from North Ridge not 20 minutes ago. Matches the description of their 4th man. Eleanor straightened, instantly alert. He's assessing the situation, trying to determine if a rescue attempt is feasible. Figured as much, Parker nodded. That's why I've already sent word to the men who were with us last night. Tom Wilson's securing the smithy. Says he can have those special bullets you mentioned ready by midday if you'll show him how. Eleanor blinked, momentarily taken aback by Parker's initiative. Special bullets? The singing ones, he clarified. Heard them myself last night. Tom says with the right modifications to the chamber design, he could replicate the effect. Sheriff Miller looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Would someone care to explain what these singing bullets are exactly? Eleanor reached into her pocket and extracted one of her custom-made cartridges, setting it on the desk, beside her blindfold. Modified ammunition. The internal chamber creates airflow during flight, producing a distinctive sound, useful for intimidation, identification, and, she paused, considering her words carefully, psychological effect. They sound like a banshee's wail, Parker added with something like reverence. Near froze my blood when I heard them last. Night, and I knew they were coming from our side. Eleanor studied Parker thoughtfully. You seem to have given this some consideration, Mr. Parker. I have, he acknowledged. Cooper's still out there, likely with connections to others in their organization. Even with Hawkins locked up, this isn't finished. We need to be prepared. Prepared for what exactly? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. For whatever comes next, Parker stated simply. Silver Pine's not a big town, Mrs. Blackwood, but it's our town. What affects one of us affects all of us. Those men targeted you and Hannah. They'll think twice before trying again if they know what and who they're facing. Martha nodded emphatically. Roberts, right. Half the town's already talking about forming a proper watch. Yesterday they might have been gossiping about Midnight Eleanor, but today they're mighty glad she's on our side. Eleanor looked between them, these ordinary townspeople who had shown extraordinary courage when it mattered most. For 7 years she had kept her distance, maintained a careful separation between herself and the community, always anticipating rejection if the truth were known. Yet here they were, not just accepting her past, but embracing the skills that came with it. I'm not that person anymore, she said softly, voicing the thought that had sustained her through 7 years of self-imposed exile. Midnight Eleanor was a spectacle, a curiosity. I left that life behind for good reasons. Sheriff Miller studied her with shrewd eyes. Did you leave it behind completely? Seemed to me those skills came back mighty quick when your daughter needed them. Hannah stirred at the mention of herself, blinking sleep from her eyes. Mama, she murmured, straightening in her chair. What's happening? Eleanor turned to her daughter, suddenly conscious of how much Hannah had yet to learn about her mother's past, and how much that past was quickly becoming their present. These good people are offering their help, she explained, choosing her words carefully. It seems our troubles aren't quite over. Hannah's gaze fell on the blindfold, and the custom bullet was still sitting on the sheriff's desk. Her expression sharpened with interest rather than fear. Because of who you were. Midnight. Eleanor? Yes, Eleanor admitted. And because men like Hawkins rarely work alone, there are likely others who will come looking for him, or for revenge. Hannah straightened, a determination in her posture that reminded Eleanor painfully of herself at that age. Then you need to teach me. Teach you? Eleanor echoed, a chill running through her at the implication. Your skills, Hannah clarified, the ones you've hidden all these years. If we're in danger because of your past, I should at least understand what that past entails. Her voice softened slightly. And I want to know that part of you, Mama. The part you've kept hidden from me. The room fell silent as Eleanor confronted the request she had dreaded since Hannah was old enough to understand her mother's differences. The reason she had buried Midnight Eleanor so deeply was precisely to prevent her daughter from following the same path. A path that had brought fame, but also isolation, spectacle, but also danger. Yet looking at Hannah now, Eleanor recognized the quiet strength that had carried the girl through her kidnapping and its aftermath. This wasn't a child seeking adventure, but a young woman asking to understand her heritage. It won't be easy, Eleanor warned, her voice thick with emotion. What I did, what I can do, it took years of practice. Then we better get started, Hannah replied with a small smile. I'm a quick study. You've always said so yourself. Martha cleared her throat, breaking the moment. Well, while you two sort that out, the rest of us have work to do. Cooper's still out there and we need to be ready. Parker nodded in agreement. I'll gather the men at Wilson's smithy. If Mrs. Blackwood is willing to share her knowledge about those special bullets, we'll have a proper arsenal by sundown. Sheriff Miller rose from his desk, authority settling over him like a familiar coat. I'll send telegrams to neighboring towns, alert them to Cooper's description and Hawkins's operation. We're not just reacting anymore, we're preparing. As the others filed out, leaving promises of return and plans for future coordination, Eleanor found herself alone with Hannah. The black silk blindfold and the custom bullet still sat on the desk between them, physical manifestations of the past that could no longer be denied or hidden away. Are you sure about this? Eleanor asked softly. Once you step into this world, it's not easily left behind. Hannah reached out, gently taking the blindfold and running it through her fingers, as she had seen her mother do countless times. I'm sure about one thing, she said with quiet conviction. I want to know who my mother really is, all of her, not just the parts she thought were safe to show. Eleanor studied her daughter's face, seeing in it the determination that had once driven a young widow to develop extraordinary skills simply to survive in a world designed for men. Perhaps, she thought, with a mixture of pride and trepidation, some legacies couldn't be buried, no matter how deeply one tried. All right, she finally agreed. We'll begin today. But Hannah, she held her daughter's gaze firmly. Knowledge is one thing, using it is another. I hope you never have to. Hannah nodded solemnly. I understand, Mamma, but better to have the skills and not need them than to need them and not have them. The words, Eleanor's own, spoken often during Hannah's childhood regarding more mundane abilities like fire starting or first aid, now took on a weight neither of them could have anticipated when they were first uttered. Outside the sheriff's office, Silver Pine was coming fully awake, its citizens moving with a new purpose. The quiet mining town had always existed on the edge of wilderness, but today it faced a different kind of frontier, one where legends stepped from shadow into sunlight and ordinary people prepared to stand against extraordinary threats. With Cooper still watching from the ridge and the likelihood of more danger to come, Eleanor Blackwood faced a truth she had long evaded. Midnight Eleanor hadn't been buried 7 years ago. She had merely been waiting, like a weapon in its sheath, for the moment when she would be needed again. The Wilson smithy blazed with unusual activity for a day when most businesses in Silver Pine remained closed. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal punctuated the morning air as Tom Wilson worked the forge with practiced precision. Around him, a small gathering of the town's most capable men watched intently as Eleanor Blackwood demonstrated the delicate process of crafting her specialized ammunition. The internal chamber must be perfectly aligned, she explained, holding up one of her custom bullets for inspection. Too shallow, and you lose the whistling effect. Too deep, and you compromise accuracy. Wilson nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with a soot-stained forearm. Never seen craftsmanship like this, Mrs. Blackwood. These modifications are ingenious. Eleanor accepted the compliment with a slight nod, still unaccustomed to openly displaying the skills she had hidden for so long. They were born of necessity. When hunting buffalo, I needed a way to track my shots by sound. The psychological impact on those hunting with me was an unexpected benefit, and on those hunted, Robert Parker added with newfound respect, saw what those bullets did to Reed and Hawkins last night, nearly jumped out of their skins when they heard that sound. Outside the smithy, in the relative privacy of the small yard behind the building, Hannah Blackwood stood with her eyes covered by the black silk blindfold. Eleanor had insisted they begin her training away from curious onlookers, though several of the townswomen, including Martha Dawson, had positioned themselves where they could observe while pretending to hang laundry or sweep porches. Focus on your breathing first, Eleanor instructed, her voice taking on the measured cadence of a teacher who had once trained herself through painful trial and error. Your senses are always working, but your brain filters most of what they detect. The blindfold doesn't enhance your hearing or smell. It simply forces your mind to process what it's already receiving. Hannah nodded, her hands slightly extended for balance. I can hear the forge, Mr. Wilson's hammer, the creak behind. The property. Good. Now move beyond the obvious sounds. What else? Hannah tilted her head slightly, concentrating. Mrs. Dawson whispering to Mrs. Parker over by the clothesline. A woodpecker in the oak tree northeast of us. Someone, a man, approaching. From the west, heavy footsteps, spurs jingling. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. Hannah had always been an observant child, but this level of auditory awareness went beyond normal perception. Very good. The man. Sheriff Miller, Hannah identified confidently. His left boot has a distinctive creak in the sole. As if summoned by the observation, Sheriff Miller rounded the corner of the smithy, stopping short at the sight of Hannah blindfolded. His questioning gaze moved to Eleanor. Training has begun, I see, he remarked, keeping his voice neutral. Eleanor nodded. Hannah insisted, and given the circumstances, I agreed basic awareness training would be prudent. Basic awareness, the sheriff repeated skeptically, watching as Hannah tracked his movements perfectly, despite the blindfold. Is that what you call it? For now, Eleanor confirmed. To Hannah, she said, "You can remove the blindfold. We'll continue later." As Hannah complied, blinking in the bright sunlight, Sheriff Miller approached Eleanor with a purposeful stride. "We need to talk, privately." Inside the smithy, the men were now actively producing the modified ammunition under Tom Wilson's supervision, using the samples Eleanor had provided as templates. The work would continue without her direct oversight. Eleanor led the sheriff to a quiet corner of the yard, her expression composed but alert. "What is it?" "Telegraph from Denver," Miller reported, his voice low. "Hawkins is more connected than we realized. His operation extends beyond land grabs. They've been systematically targeting strategic locations for the coming railroad. Federal marshals have been tracking them for months." "Then this is bigger than Silver Pine," Eleanor concluded. Miller nodded grimly. "Much bigger and more dangerous. The marshals are sending a detachment, but they're 3 days out at least. Until then, we're on our own." "Cooper knows this," Eleanor surmised. "That's why he hasn't fled. He's waiting for reinforcements." "Most likely," the sheriff agreed. "My deputy spotted fresh tracks this morning. At least 6 riders arrived at North Ridge before dawn. Cooper's gathering strength." Eleanor absorbed this information, her tactical mind already calculating possibilities. They'll move soon. Tonight, perhaps. A jailbreak for Hawkins and the others would be the first priority. "My thoughts exactly," Miller confirmed. "I've doubled the jail guard, but we're stretched thin. Silver Pine wasn't built for this kind of trouble." Hannah had drifted closer, listening intently to their conversation. "They'll come for us, too, won't they?" she asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of her question. "For Mama and me." Eleanor and the sheriff exchanged glances, neither wanting to frighten the girl unnecessarily, but both recognizing Hannah was too perceptive to be shielded with comforting lies. "Yes," Eleanor answered honestly. "Our farm is isolated, vulnerable, and Hawkins seems to have developed a personal vendetta beyond his original interest in the land." "We can't defend both the jail and your property," Miller stated, the frustration evident in his voice. "Not with the numbers we have." Hannah straightened, a determined glint in her eye that reminded Eleanor painfully of herself at that age. "Then we need to make them choose," the girl suggested. "Create a situation where they can't attack both simultaneously." Both adults turned to her with surprise. Hannah continued, warming to her strategy. "If they believe Mama is guarding the jail personally, they'd have to deal with her before attempting a rescue. But if they think we're defended at home, they might split their forces." Eleanor studied her daughter with newfound respect. "Military strategy, Hannah. Where did you learn that?" A faint blush colored the girl's cheeks. "From your books, Mama, the ones you keep locked in your trunk. I found the key when I was 12. Instead of the anger Hannah clearly expected, Eleanor felt a surge of pride mixed with rueful amusement. Her daughter had been accessing her hidden past for years without her knowledge. "Sheriff," Eleanor said, turning to Miller with renewed purpose, "Hannah's right. We need to control where and how this confrontation happens, and I think I know how." As Eleanor outlined her strategy, she felt a familiar sense of clarity. The focus that had once allowed her to track buffalo across miles of prairie, to anticipate their movements before they themselves knew which way they would turn. Human predators, she had learned long ago, were ultimately more predictable than buffalo bulls, driven by simpler motivations: greed, revenge, fear. By mid-afternoon, Wilson's smithy had produced nearly 100 of the specialized singing bullets, distributed among the town's most capable marksmen. Eleanor had overseen a crash course in their use, emphasizing that the psychological impact was as important as their physical effect. "The sound creates confusion, disrupts concentration," she explained to the assembled defenders. "Even experienced gunmen hesitate when they can't determine where a shot is coming from, or when it sounds unlike anything they've heard before. Robert Parker nodded in understanding. Psychological warfare, like Indian war cries or cavalry bugles. Precisely, Eleanor confirmed. You're not just firing a bullet, you're sending a message. The message is you are outmatched. As the town prepared for the coming confrontation, Eleanor took Hannah to a secluded clearing behind the church for the next phase of her training. This location offered privacy while still being within the protective circle of the town. The blindfold is only the beginning, Eleanor explained, her voice taking on the measured cadence of a teacher imparting crucial knowledge. True awareness comes from understanding how your entire body perceives the world. Every sense, every instinct has value. She positioned Hannah in the center of the clearing, blindfolded once again. We'll start with something simple. I'm going to move around you in a circle. Each time I stop, I want you to point to my location. How? Hannah asked, her voice betraying a hint of frustration. I can hear your footsteps, but when you stop moving, listen deeper, Eleanor instructed. For my breathing, the subtle shift of clothing, the displacement of air, even the warmth of a human body can be felt if you're attuned to it. For the next hour, Eleanor guided Hannah through increasingly complex awareness exercises. To her mingled pride and concern. The girl demonstrated an aptitude that bordered on uncanny. By the fifth attempt, Hannah could pinpoint Eleanor's position within inches, even when her mother deliberately controlled her breathing and movement to minimize sound. You're a natural, Eleanor admitted, both pleased and troubled by this revelation. The skills she had developed out of necessity and years of practice seemed to come to Hannah with intuitive ease. Better than I was at twice your age. Hannah removed the blindfold, her expression a mixture of accomplishment and uncertainty. Is that good or bad? Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. It simply is. These abilities are neither good nor bad in themselves. It's how they're used that matters. She reached out, gently taking the blindfold from Hannah's hands. My father used to say that exceptional gifts carry exceptional responsibilities. When I developed these skills, I chose to use them for survival, for independence in a world that offered few options to women alone. Hannah nodded slowly, absorbing her mother's words. And now, how will we use them now? To protect, Eleanor answered without hesitation. To defend what matters, our home, our friends, our town. Never to harm unnecessarily, never to intimidate the innocent. The sun had begun its westward descent, casting long shadows across the clearing. Soon evening would fall, bringing with it the very real possibility of confrontation with Cooper and his reinforcements. The peaceful rhythm of Silver Pine had been irreversibly altered, and Eleanor knew that whatever happened in the coming hours would determine not just their safety, but the future shape of their lives. There's one more thing I need to show you, Eleanor said, leading Hannah toward the church. Something I retrieved from our farm this morning while you were resting. Inside the empty church, Eleanor had stored a long, narrow case, crafted of polished wood with brass fittings. She opened it carefully to reveal a weapon Hannah had never seen before. Not the Winchester repeating rifle her mother typically used for hunting, but a specialized Sharps buffalo rifle, its stock inlaid with intricate designs, its barrel gleaming with meticulous care. I thought you sold your Sharps, Hannah whispered, recognizing the weapon from the stories Cooper had unearthed. I sold one of them, Eleanor corrected. This one I could never part with. It was a gift from the Pawnee chief who taught me to track, a symbol of respect I earned after saving his son during a blizzard. She lifted the rifle, testing its familiar weight and balance. Tonight, Midnight Eleanor rides again. Not as a spectacle or a curiosity, but as a protector. It's time to show Cooper and his men exactly what they've awakened in Silver Pine. Dusk settled over Silver Pine like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a silence uncommon for the usually lively frontier town. No piano notes drifted from the saloon. No children played in the streets. No shopkeepers chatted on wooden porches. Instead, an eerie stillness had descended, broken only by the occasional creak of a rocking chair or the distant whinny of a horse. To the casual observer, Silver Pine might have appeared abandoned, but careful eyes would have noted the subtle signs of vigilant preparation. The occasional glint of a rifle barrel in an upstairs window, the strategic positioning of water barrels in case of fire, the absence of the elderly and children who had been quietly relocated to the stone church at the town's centre. From her vantage point atop the roof of Dawson's General Store, Eleanor Blackwood surveyed the town's perimeter with the practiced eye of a hunter. The Sharp's rifle lay ready beside her, its brass fittings catching the last rays of sunset. She had positioned herself carefully, visible enough to be noticed by watching eyes, yet protected by multiple angles of cover. Below, Sheriff Miller completed his final check of the town's defenses. The jail had been fortified as much as possible, with additional barricades and 4 of his most trusted deputies standing guard. The remaining defenders, townspeople who had volunteered despite the danger, were distributed according to Eleanor's tactical assessment, utilizing natural cover and overlapping fields of fire. As darkness deepened, Eleanor sensed rather than saw movement along the northern ridge. Cooper and his reinforcements were making their approach. She had anticipated this. Predators preferred the cover of darkness, and these men, despite their bravado, were ultimately predators of the most basic kind. Sheriff Miller climbed to join her, his breathing slightly labored from the exertion. "They're coming," he stated, more confirmation than question. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her eyes never leaving the distant ridge. 8 riders, possibly more behind them. Cooper's in the lead. Miller squinted into the gathering darkness. "How can you possibly see that from here?" Eleanor didn't explain that it wasn't just sight she relied upon. It was the culmination of all her senses, the intuitive awareness that had once allowed her to track buffalo through blinding snowstorms. Instead, she simply said, "Experience." "Hannah's secure at the church?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Her daughter had protested being separated, but Eleanor had been adamant. Hannah's training had barely begun. She wasn't ready for what was coming. "Parker's wife and Martha Dawson are with her and the others," Miller confirmed. "Stone walls, single entrance, well defended." Eleanor nodded, satisfied with the arrangement. The church was the most defensible structure in Silver Pine, and while she trusted Hannah's developing abilities, tonight was not the time to test them in combat. "They'll send scouts first," she predicted, adjusting her position slightly to maintain her view of the ridge. 2, maybe 3 men to assess our defenses before the main force moves in. How do you want to handle them?" Eleanor considered the question, weighing options against probabilities with the calculation of a seasoned strategist. "Let them enter town, observe our preparations, then I'll deliver the ultimatum." "Ultimatum?" Miller echoed, surprise evident in his voice. "Men like Cooper respect strength above all else," Eleanor explained. "They understand boundaries, consequences. Before this turns to bloodshed, they need to know exactly what they're facing." As predicted, within the hour 2 riders entered the EU outskirts of Silver Pine, moving cautiously through the shadowed streets. They made no attempt at stealth. This was reconnaissance, not attack. Eleanor tracked their progress without moving, her stillness born of years spent in hunting blinds where the slightest motion could alert wary game. The scouts completed their circuit of the main street, pausing briefly to study the reinforced jail before turning their horses back toward the northern ridge. Eleanor waited until they had nearly reached the town limits before making her move. Rising to a stable shooting position, she shouldered the Sharp's rifle with practiced ease. The weight and balance of the weapon felt like greeting an old friend, familiar, trustworthy, an extension of herself. She drew a measured breath, held it briefly, and squeezed the trigger. The distinctive crack of the sharps split the night, followed instantly by the eerie whistling of the specialized bullet. Her shot struck the ground directly between the two riders, sending dirt and gravel spraying upward. The horses reared in panic, nearly unseating their riders who struggled to maintain control. Before they could recover, Eleanor had already reloaded with the swift efficiency that had once made. Audiences gasped in disbelief. Her second shot whistled over their heads, close enough that one of the men instinctively ducked. "That's far enough," she called, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. "The next one won't miss." The scouts froze, clearly recognizing the distinctive sound of the singing bullets that had become synonymous with Midnight Eleanor in frontier legend. "Tell Cooper I want to speak with him," Eleanor continued, never lowering the rifle. "Just him. 20 minutes at the edge of town. If he values his men's lives, he'll come along." The scouts exchanged nervous glances before spurring their horses into a gallop, heading back toward the ridge, with considerably more haste than they had shown on their approach. Sheriff Miller regarded Eleanor with newfound respect. "Didn't take you for the diplomatic type." A grim smile touched Eleanor's lips. "This isn't diplomacy, Sheriff. It's establishing dominance. Wild animals understand it. So do men like Cooper." 20 minutes later, Eleanor stood at the northern edge of town, a solitary figure illuminated by the light of a single lantern placed at her feet. The Sharp's rifle was held casually but ready in her hands, its barrel gleaming dully in the lamplight. Behind her, the town appeared quiet, though she knew every shadow concealed a defender ready to provide covering fire if needed. From the darkness beyond the lantern's glow came the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider moving at a deliberate pace. Frank Cooper emerged from the shadows, his unmemorable features hardened into a mask of calculation. He ruined his horse to a stop just outside the circle of light. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with mock civility. "Or should I say, Midnight Eleanor, your reputation precedes you." "As does yours, Mr. Cooper," she replied evenly. "A man who uses research and knowledge as weapons, more dangerous in some ways than those who rely merely on guns." Cooper inclined his head, accepting the assessment as a compliment. "I admit I was skeptical when I first connected the quiet widow of Silver Pine to the legendary huntress. But after last night's performance, all doubts have been removed." "Then you understand what you're facing," Eleanor stated. "Not just me, but an entire town prepared to defend itself." Cooper's gaze flickered briefly toward the shadowed buildings behind her. "Impressive mobilization for a mining settlement. But we have numbers, Mrs. Blackwood, experienced men who won't be intimidated by a few armed townspeople." "Numbers don't always determine the outcome, Mr. Cooper. Quality often trumps quantity." Eleanor shifted slightly, allowing the lantern light to catch the distinctive modifications of her Sharp's rifle, especially when the odds are equalized by specialized equipment and intimate knowledge of terrain. Cooper studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Leave," Eleanor said simply. "Take your men and go. The federal marshals are already en route. They'll arrive within days. Hawkins and the others will face justice regardless of what you do tonight." "Abandoning my associates would be bad for business," Cooper countered. "My reputation is built on reliability." "Your reputation won't matter if you're dead," Eleanor pointed out with calm precision. "Every man who enters Silver Pine tonight with hostile intent will be met with lethal force. I personally guarantee it." To emphasize her point, Eleanor raised the Sharp slightly and fired without seeming to aim. The singing bullet whistled through the darkness, striking Cooper's hat and sending it flying from his head. Before he could react, she had reloaded and leveled the rifle again, the entire sequence executed with fluid grace. Cooper remained impressively still, though his horse shifted nervously beneath him. "Remarkable aim," he acknowledged, his voice betraying only a hint of unease. "But I have 14 men on that ridge, Mrs. Blackwood. Even you can't shoot that many before some get through." "Perhaps not," Eleanor conceded. "But consider this. Mr. Cooper, I don't need to stop all of your men, just you." The implication hung in the air between them, clear and undeniable. Eleanor continued, her voice level but carrying an edge of steel. "You're the brain of this operation. Without you, they're just hired guns with no direction, and you're currently well within my range." Cooper's eyes narrowed as he calculated his odds. Self-preservation warred visibly with professional pride and potential profit. "You have until midnight to clear out," Eleanor stated, delivering her ultimatum with finality. "After that, Silver Pine will consider any armed man approaching the town as hostile. And Mr. Cooper," she added, her voice dropping slightly, "I personally will be watching the ridge with this." She patted the Sharp's rifle, its meaning unmistakable. The weapon that had dropped Buffalo at 1,000 yards could certainly handle human targets at half that distance. "You're making a mistake," Cooper said finally, though his tone lacked conviction. "Hawkins has powerful friends. This won't end tonight, regardless of your threats." "That's where you're wrong," Eleanor replied. "This ends exactly how we decide. It ends. Silver Pine has chosen to stand against men like you and Hawkins. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Cooper retrieved his hat from the dust, brushing it off with deliberate motions that betrayed his need to regain composure. He settled it back on his head, regarding Eleanor with reluctant respect. "You know," he said as he gathered his reins, "when I first discovered who you were, I thought Hawkins could use it against you, that a frontier town would reject a woman with your unconventional past. I miscalculated." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "You did. Silver Pine judges people by their actions, not their histories. It's why I chose this place. It's why we'll defend it to the last bullet." Cooper nodded slowly, a decision visibly forming behind his calculating eyes. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back into the darkness, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading into the night. Sheriff Miller emerged from the shadows once Cooper was well away. "Think he'll take the offer?" Eleanor's gaze remained fixed on the distant ridge, where faint movements suggested Cooper was rejoining his men. "He's a businessman at heart. When risks outweigh potential rewards, businessmen cut their losses." "And if he doesn't?" Miller pressed. Eleanor shouldered her rifle, her expression resolute in the lantern light. "Then Silver Pine gives him a lesson in frontier justice he won't survive to remember." As they walked back toward town, Eleanor felt the weight of the coming hours settling upon her shoulders. Cooper's choice, retreat or attack, would determine whether this night ended in peace or bloodshed. Either way, there would be no returning to the quiet anonymity she had cultivated for 7 years. For better or worse, Midnight Eleanor had emerged from the shadows, and Silver Pine would never view the widow Blackwood the same way again. Midnight approached with the slow, inexorable certainty of a gathering storm. Eleanor Blackwood had resumed her position atop Dawson's general store, the Sharp's rifle a comforting weight across her lap as she scanned the northern ridge through a brass spyglass. The town below remained eerily quiet, every defender in position, every non-combatant secure in the stone church. Beside her, Martha Dawson kept watch over the eastern approach, a shotgun clutched in hands, more accustomed to measuring flour and sugar. The shopkeeper had insisted on joining Eleanor, despite having no combat experience, arguing that her knowledge of the town's layout might prove valuable. "Movement on the ridge," Eleanor murmured, collapsing the spyglass with a soft click. "They're breaking camp." Martha tensed. "Coming or going?" "That's the question," Eleanor replied, adjusting her position to better view the distant figures. Cooper's men had maintained their position since the ultimatum, their campfires visible against the night sky as they awaited their leader's decision. Now, those fires were being extinguished one by one. Sheriff Miller's voice drifted up from the street below. "Mrs. Blackwood, any developments?" "They're on the move," Eleanor called down softly. "Get ready." The sheriff nodded and moved to alert the other defenders. Eleanor returned her attention to the ridge, her experienced eyes picking out details that others might miss. The pattern of movement, the direction of travel, the deliberate way the fires were being doused. "They're splitting up," she realized aloud. "3 groups, Cooper's dividing his forces." Martha frowned. "Why would he do that if he's retreating?" "He wouldn't," Eleanor concluded grimly. "He's attacking, trying to spread our defenses thin." The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the night air. Cooper had seemed a rational man, one who could calculate odds and recognize when a situation was untenable. Yet he was choosing confrontation, despite the risks she had made clear. "We need to warn the others," Martha said, already moving toward the ladder that led down from the roof. Eleanor caught her arm. "Wait. Look there." She pointed toward the southern edge of town, where flickering lights had appeared. Riders, with torches, approaching from the direction opposite the ridge. "He brought more men than we thought. They're trying to surround us." The strategy was clear now. Cooper had kept his main force visible on the ridge, while positioning a second group to approach from behind. A classic pincer movement, designed to trap defenders between 2 advancing forces. Eleanor's mind raced through possible countermoves. The town had prepared for an attack from the north, with defensive positions oriented accordingly. Repositioning now would create confusion, vulnerability. "Go to the church," she instructed Martha. "Tell Parker and Wilson to shift half their men to cover the southern approach. The rest stay focused on the north. Move quickly but quietly. We don't want them to know we've spotted the flanking force." As Martha hurried to deliver the message, Eleanor settled into the practiced stillness of a hunter preparing for the decisive moment. She checked the sharps one final time, confirming what she already knew. The weapon was perfectly maintained, loaded with one of her specialized bullets, ready to announce Midnight Eleanor's return in a way that couldn't be ignored. Below, Sheriff Miller was already redirecting his deputies, his voice low but urgent as he relayed Eleanor's observations. The town's defenses pivoted in response, maintaining the appearance of focusing northward while quietly reinforcing the southern perimeter. Eleanor's gaze returned to the ridge, where Cooper's main force had begun to descend in 3 distinct groups. Their approach was measured, professional. These weren't common bandits but experienced fighters, likely former soldiers turned mercenaries. 8 men in the central column, with smaller groups of 3 each moving to the flank from east and west. The southern force was smaller but moving faster, clearly intending to strike the supposedly undefended rear of the town. Eleanor counted 5 riders, their torches creating the illusion of a larger group. A common tactic to intimidate defenders. 19 in total, she noted to herself. More than Cooper claimed, but not unmanageable. Through her spyglass, she located Cooper himself, riding in the center column but positioned toward the rear, directing rather than leading. A strategist, not a frontline fighter. Eleanor filed this observation away, adjusting her plan accordingly. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness as the attacking forces closed in. Eleanor remained motionless, conserving energy, controlling her breathing as she had once done during day-long hunting expeditions. The first shot would be crucial, not just for its tactical impact, but for the psychological effect it would have on Cooper's men. From the church, a single lantern flashed briefly, Parker's signal that the southern defenders were in position. Eleanor acknowledged with a similar flash from her own small lantern, then extinguished it completely. The town had gone dark now, offering no easy targets for the approaching riders. The northern force reached the edge of town first, hesitating at the eerie silence that greeted them. Cooper raised his hand, halting the advance as he assessed the situation. Even from a distance, Eleanor could read the suspicion in his posture. He had expected resistance, perhaps even welcomed it. The complete absence of visible defenders was clearly unsettling. This was the moment Eleanor had been waiting for. With fluid grace, she raised the sharps to her shoulder, drew a measured breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the night like thunder, the specialized bullet emitting its distinctive whistle as it flew unerringly toward its target. Cooper's hat flew from his head for the second time that night, this time accompanied by a few strands of hair, a warning shot accurate to within a fraction of an inch. Before the echo had faded, Eleanor had reloaded and fired again, this time striking the ground directly in front of the lead rider of the western flanking group. Her third shot, following with astonishing rapidity, took the torch from the hand of an eastern rider without harming the man himself. The effect was instantaneous. Cooper's men scattered for cover, their coordinated advance dissolving into confusion. 3 shots from 3 different directions in less than 5 seconds. It created the impression of multiple expert marksmen rather than a single shooter. "That's far enough," Eleanor called, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "The next shots won't be warnings." As if to emphasize her point, the town suddenly came alive with the metallic sound of weapons being readied, rifles cocked, shotguns racked, revolvers clicking into position. From every shadow and doorway, defenders revealed themselves, their guns gleaming dully in the moonlight. Cooper's voice rang out from behind an overturned wagon where he had taken shelter. "You're outnumbered, Mrs. Blackwood, even with your townspeople. You can't hold off 19 experienced fighters." "Perhaps not," Eleanor agreed, still invisible to the attackers, her voice seemingly coming from everywhere and nowhere. "But how many of your men will fall before we're overwhelmed?" "Who will be first, you, Mr. Cooper?" To punctuate her question, another singing bullet whistled through the air, striking the wagon mere inches from Cooper's position. The sound it made, part whistle, part moan, seemed almost supernatural in the tense night. "And there's something else you should consider," Eleanor continued, reloading with practiced efficiency. "While you've been focused on me, federal marshals have been making better time than expected. They crossed Thunder Creek before sundown. They'll be here by morning." This was a calculated bluff. The marshals were still at least 2 days away, but Cooper had no way to verify the claim. Eleanor watched through her spyglass as he processed this new information, visibly weighing options and outcomes. "You're lying," he called back, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Am I?" Eleanor challenged. She fired again, this time targeting the rifle of a man who had begun to take aim at one of the town defenders. The weapon spun from his grasp, leaving him staring in disbelief at his empty hands. "Would you bet your life on that assumption, Mr. Cooper, the lives of your men?" From the southern edge of town came the sound of gunfire as the flanking force encountered the defenders Eleanor had repositioned. The shooting was brief but intense, followed by voices raised in alarm and the thunder of retreating hoofbeats. "Your southern attack has failed," Eleanor announced, allowing satisfaction to color her tone. 5 men against our prepared positions. Poor. Odds, Mr. Cooper, almost as poor as your remaining 14 against the rest of us. Cooper's response was cut short by the sudden appearance of Sheriff Miller, who had circled behind the wagon during the distraction. The lawman's revolver pressed firmly against Cooper's temple, forcing him to freeze mid-movement. "Evening, Cooper," Miller said conversationally, relieving the man of his weapons with his free hand. "Seem to find yourself in a tactically disadvantageous position." With their leader captured, the remaining attackers faced a critical decision: continue the fight without direction or retreat while they still could. Eleanor observed their hesitation through her spyglass, noting how they looked to each other for guidance that wouldn't come. "Your employer is in custody," she called out to them, her voice carrying authority earned through years of commanding attention. "The Southern force has retreated. Federal marshals are en route. You have exactly 1 minute to drop your weapons and surrender, or demonstrate how well you can ride with bullets whistling past your ears." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft thud of guns being set on the ground as Coopers, men hardened fighters though they were, recognized the futility of their position. Without their leader, without the element of surprise, facing unknown numbers of defenders who clearly held the tactical advantage, surrender became the only rational choice. As Sheriff Miller and his deputies moved to secure the prisoners, Eleanor finally descended from her perch atop the general store. The confrontation had ended with remarkably little bloodshed, a few minor injuries among the Southern attackers, but no fatalities on either side. Martha Dawson met her at the bottom of the ladder, shotgun still clutched in white-knuckled hands, but a smile of relief lighting her face. "It worked. Your plan actually worked." Eleanor nodded, the tension of the past hours beginning to ebb from her shoulders. Cooper miscalculated. He thought numbers and experience would be enough. That we would be disorganized, afraid. "He didn't account for having Midnight Eleanor coordinating our defense," Martha observed with newfound respect. "No," Eleanor agreed quietly. "He didn't." As the town secured the prisoners and tended to the few wounded, Eleanor found herself the center of attention, the quiet widow whose hidden skills had transformed Silver Pine's defense from hopeless to victorious. The looks directed her way held a new mixture of awe, gratitude, and something she hadn't expected: acceptance. For 7 years, she had hidden her true self from these people, certain that the revelation of Midnight Eleanor would bring rejection and isolation. Yet here they were, nodding respectfully as she passed, some even reaching out to touch her arm or shoulder in gestures of thanks and solidarity. The confrontation had ended, but Eleanor sensed that for her and Hannah, a different kind of journey was just beginning, one where past and present no longer needed to remain separate, where the skills she had hidden might find new purpose in the community she had come to call home. Dawn broke over Silver Pine, casting golden light across a town transformed by the night's events. The jail, never designed to hold so many prisoners, now bulged with Cooper's men alongside Hawkins and his original crew. Sheriff Miller had been forced to convert the adjacent storage room into additional holding space, with deputies working in shifts to maintain security. In the center of town, the church doors finally opened, allowing those who had sheltered inside to emerge into the morning light. Hannah was among the first to appear, scanning the gathered townspeople with anxious eyes until she spotted Eleanor standing near the sheriff's office. The girl broke into a run, weaving through the crowd to throw her arms around her mother. "You're all right," Hannah breathed, her voice muffled against Eleanor's shoulder. "When we heard the shooting..." Eleanor returned the embrace tightly, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability after hours of necessary steel. "I'm fine. Everyone's fine. It's over." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Eleanor knew they weren't entirely true. The immediate danger had passed, but the repercussions of the night's events were just beginning to unfold. Her carefully constructed identity as the unassuming widow Blackwood had been irrevocably shattered. Midnight Eleanor stood, revealed to all, her legendary skills displayed in full view of the town she had called home for 7 years. Sheriff Miller approached, his face showing the weariness of a man who had gone too long without sleep, yet couldn't afford to rest. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her with a respectful nod. "Got a situation developing." Eleanor gently disengaged from Hannah's embrace, instantly alert. "Cooper's men?" "No, they're secure. It's the town council." Miller gestured toward the town hall, where several well-dressed men had gathered on the steps, their expressions serious as they conferred in low voices. "They've called an emergency meeting. About you." A chill ran through Eleanor despite the warming morning air. This was what she had feared since arriving in Silver Pine, official rejection once her past became known. The same scenario had played out in 2 previous towns, forcing her to relocate each time. "I see," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "When?" "Now," Miller replied. "They've asked to see you immediately." He hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I told them they owe you their lives and their town. All of us do." Hannah straightened beside her mother, chin lifting in a gesture of defiance. "I'm coming with you." Eleanor considered refusing, wanting to shield her daughter from whatever judgment awaited. But the determination in Hannah's eyes stopped her. After everything that had happened, separation would be its own kind of cruelty. "All right," she agreed. "Together, then." As they walked toward the town hall, Eleanor was acutely aware of the eyes following their progress, some curious, some grateful, some still wary. Martha Dawson broke away from a group near the general store to fall into step beside them. "Heading to face the Inquisition?" the shopkeeper asked bluntly. Eleanor's lips twitched despite her apprehension. "Something like that." "Well, they can't face it without me," Martha declared. "After all, I participated in the defense. If they're questioning your methods, they're questioning mine too." The unexpected show of solidarity brought a lump to Eleanor's throat. Before she could respond, Robert Parker and Tom Wilson joined their small procession, followed by several others who had stood with her during the confrontation. By the time they reached the town hall steps, nearly a dozen people had gathered in support. Inside the council chamber, 5 men sat behind a long table, their expressions ranging from thoughtful to troubled. Mayor Howard Collins, a former banker, with a perpetually worried brow, occupied the center chair. To his right sat Reverend James Matthews, the church pastor whose gentle manner belied a sharp intellect. The remaining seats were filled by businessmen who comprised Silver Pine's unofficial leadership. Mayor Collins cleared his throat as Eleanor entered with her impromptu entourage. "Mrs. Blackwood, thank you for coming. We weren't expecting quite so many. These people stood with me last night to defend this town," Eleanor stated calmly. "They've earned the right to be here." The mayor nodded, conceding the point. "Very well, please be seated." As chairs were arranged for the unexpected audience, Eleanor remained standing, her posture straight, her eyes steady as she faced the council. Hannah stayed close beside her, a silent statement of solidarity. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mayor Collins began once everyone had settled, "recent events have brought to light certain aspects of your past that were previously unknown to this community. Information that raises questions about if you're referring to my history as Midnight Eleanor." She interrupted smoothly. "Then yes, I was once known throughout the territories for my shooting exhibitions and hunting expeditions. I didn't hide this information so much as choose not to volunteer it when I settled here." Reverend Matthews leaned forward, his kind face serious. "The concern, Mrs. Blackwood, isn't that you were a renowned markswoman. It's that you concealed this identity from us for 7 years, suggesting a deliberate attempt to mislead the community that welcomed you." Eleanor felt Hannah tense beside her, but continued calmly. "I came to Silver Pine seeking peace and normalcy for my daughter after losing my husband. My skills with a rifle had made me a spectacle in other places, something to be gawked at rather than a person to be known. Yes, I chose to present myself simply as a widow seeking a fresh start. I don't apologize for wanting my daughter to grow up without being defined by her mother's notoriety." Martha Dawson spoke up from behind her. "And a good thing she did have. Those skills, given what happened last night. Where would Silver Pine be if she'd been just another helpless widow when Hawkins and his gang came calling?" Murmurs of agreement rose from Eleanor's supporters, forcing the mayor to rap his knuckles on the table for order. No one disputes that Mrs. Blackwood's abilities were instrumental in defending the town, he acknowledged. The question before this council is more fundamental. Can we trust someone who has concealed such a significant part of her identity? What else might she be hiding? The accusation hung in the air, sharp and painful. Eleanor had anticipated rejection, but the suggestion that her character itself was suspect cut deeper than expected. Before she could respond, Hannah stepped forward, her young face set with determination. "My mother hid who she was because people like you made her feel she had to," she stated, her voice clear and steady. She was afraid of exactly this, being judged for her unusual skills rather than for her character. For 7 years she's been nothing but honest, hard-working and kind to everyone in Silver Pine. The only thing she concealed was her abilities that saved this town last night. A heavy silence followed Hannah's impassioned defense. Eleanor felt a surge of pride mixed with concern, proud of her daughter's eloquence and courage, concerned that her outburst might further prejudice the council against them. To her surprise, Reverend Matthews nodded slowly. "The young lady makes a fair point. Actions speak louder than words, and Mrs. Blackwood's actions have consistently demonstrated good character since her arrival in Silver Pine. There's also the matter of her land," one of the businessmen added pragmatically. "The very reason Hawkins targeted her in the first place. That pass through the mountains will be crucial once the railroad arrives." "Do we really want to alienate the person who controls it?" Eleanor frowned at the mercenary calculation. "My land is not for sale, regardless of the council's decision about my place in this community." Mayor Collins raised his hands placatingly. "No one is suggesting you should sell, Mrs. Blackwood. Quite the contrary. The tactical advantages of having someone with your unique skills positioned at such a strategic location have become abundantly clear." Eleanor studied the council members with new understanding. This wasn't about moral judgment after all. It was about Silver Pine's future security. The town had experienced firsthand what having a legendary markswoman in their midst could mean for their safety. "So," she said carefully, "you're not asking me to leave because of my past. You're considering whether my presence is an asset or a liability to Silver Pine." "Precisely," Mayor Collins confirmed, looking relieved that she understood. "Last night demonstrated the protective value of your abilities, but also attracted dangerous attention to our town." "Hawkins and Cooper weren't attracted by my reputation," Eleanor pointed out. "They came for the land, for its strategic value to their criminal operations. My identity was incidental, something Cooper discovered during his research." Reverend Matthews nodded thoughtfully. "She's right. The railroad's coming regardless of who Mrs. Blackwood is or what she can do. Better to have her skills on our side than not." A new voice joined the discussion as Sheriff Miller stepped forward from where he had been quietly observing. "There's something else the council should consider. The federal marshals just arrived, rode through the night once they received my telegraph about Hawkins and Cooper. They've made an interesting proposal." All eyes turned to the sheriff as he continued. "Given the strategic importance of McClintock Pass and Mrs. Blackwood's unique qualifications, they suggest establishing an official peacekeeping outpost on her property, with her as a deputized special marshal." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the room. Eleanor herself was taken aback by the suggestion. "A woman marshal? Is that even possible?" "Not officially," Miller admitted, "but a special deputy with jurisdiction over the pass. That's within their authority to grant, especially for someone with your particular skills and reputation." Mayor Collins exchanged glances with the other council members, a silent communication passing between them. This would place Silver Pine under federal protection without the expense of maintaining our own expanded force, he observed, the practical advantages clearly appealing to him. It would also formalize Mrs. Blackwood's role, Reverend Matthews added. Rather than a secretive past, her abilities would become an acknowledged public service. Eleanor felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had come to this meeting expecting to defend her right to remain in the community, perhaps even to face expulsion. Instead, she was being offered an official position of authority, a legitimization of the very skills she had hidden for so long. "I would need to consider it carefully," she said, looking down at Hannah. "My primary concern has always been providing stability for my daughter." Hannah's eyes shone with barely contained excitement. "Mama, this is perfect. You wouldn't have to hide who you are anymore. Your skills would be helping people officially." Martha Dawson stepped forward, adding her practical perspective. "You could still run your farm, still make your preserves. But you'd also be doing what you were born to do, using those extraordinary abilities for something that matters." Eleanor looked around at the gathered faces, the council members now viewing her as a potential asset, her neighbors standing in support, her daughter practically vibrating with excitement at the possibilities. For 7 years, she had suppressed essential parts of herself, convinced that acceptance could only come through conformity. Yet here was an unexpected resolution, not rejection of her differences, but a new purpose built around them. "I'll speak with the marshals," she decided, feeling as though a weight she had carried for years was finally beginning to lift. "But whatever role I might accept, Silver Pine is our home. That hasn't changed." Mayor Collins nodded, visibly relieved at the peaceful resolution. "Then this council sees no reason why it should. Midnight Eleanor or Widow Blackwood, either way, you've proven yourself a valuable member of this community." As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor found herself surrounded by well-wishers and curious neighbors, many now eager to learn more about the skills she had demonstrated during the night's confrontation. The very abilities she had hidden for fear of rejection were suddenly objects of admiration and respect. Hannah squeezed her mother's hand, her smile radiant. "See, you didn't have to choose between who you were and who you've become. You just needed the right place to be both." Looking at her daughter's face, Eleanor realized that perhaps the most unexpected resolution of all was within herself, the reconciliation of the legendary Midnight Eleanor with the devoted mother she had become. Not separate identities in conflict, but complementary aspects of a whole person finally free to exist in the light of day. 1 year had passed since the night Cooper's men had attempted to take Silver Pine. The town had changed in subtle but significant ways, growing in both size and confidence. New buildings lined Main Street, including an expanded sheriff's office and a proper schoolhouse where Hannah Blackwood now taught reading and mathematics 3 days a week. The autumn air carried a crisp edge as Eleanor stood on the porch of a farmhouse, surveying the improvements that marked her property. The barn had been expanded, a new stable added, and a small but sturdy outbuilding now served as the official McClintock Pass Ranger Station, the federal government's compromise title for what was essentially Eleanor's jurisdiction as a special deputy marshal. The silver badge pinned to her vest caught the morning light as she adjusted the leather gun belt that had become as much a part of her daily attire as her apron had once been. Not that she had abandoned her previous life entirely. Jars of her preserves still lined the shelves of Dawson's general store, and her butter remained Silver Pine's finest. But these domestic accomplishments now existed alongside her more unusual talents rather than serving as a disguise for them. "Mama!" Hannah's voice called from inside the house. "The students will be here any minute." Eleanor smiled at her daughter's excitement. At 18, Hannah had developed into a natural teacher, but her educational offerings went far beyond traditional academics. Today marked the beginning of a new program, weekly classes in marksmanship and tracking for the town's older children, with Eleanor and Hannah as joint instructors. "The targets are all set up," Eleanor called back, gesturing toward the field where she had arranged a series of challenging but achievable shooting positions. Nothing that would overwhelm beginners, but enough to develop genuine skill over time. Hannah emerged from the house, carrying a wooden case containing the training rifles, smaller, lighter versions of standard weapons that Eleanor had commissioned from a gunsmith in Denver. Behind her trailed Martha Dawson's twin sons, who had volunteered to help set up the day's lesson. Mrs. Blackwood, one of the boys, Timothy or Thomas, she still struggled to tell them apart, asked with undisguised eagerness, "Are you going to show us the blindfold shooting today?" Eleanor shook her head, amused by their persistent fascination with her more theatrical skills. "Basic marksmanship first, boys. You need to master the fundamentals before attempting anything advanced." "But you promised someday," the other twin reminded her. "And someday I will," Eleanor assured them, "when you're ready." The sound of approaching wagons and horses announced the arrival of the students. A dozen children ranging from 12 to 16, boys and girls alike. Silver Pine had embraced the progressive notion that frontier skills belonged to everyone, regardless of gender. Eleanor took particular satisfaction in watching young girls take their places alongside the boys, their faces showing the same determination that had once driven her to develop her own abilities against all social expectations. Sheriff Miller rode in shortly behind the students, his presence both official and supportive. He had become one of Eleanor's strongest allies over the past year, helping to integrate her unusual position into the town's governance. "Special Deputy Blackwood," he greeted her with a tip of his hat and the formal title he used in public settings. "Fine day for shooting lessons." "Indeed it is, Sheriff," she replied, returning the professional courtesy. "Will you be observing today?" "Just passing through on my rounds. Wanted to let you know the Butterfield stage arrived safely at Wilson Station. No sign of trouble along the pass." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. The route through McClintock Pass had proven as valuable as Hawkins had anticipated, becoming a key transportation link once the railroad construction began. But unlike Hawkins' plans for exploitation, the pass now served legitimate commerce and travel, protected by what travelers had come to call the Midnight Watch. As the students gathered, in a semicircle, Hannah stepped forward to begin the lesson, her confidence evident in every movement. Eleanor watched with quiet pride as her daughter explained the basic principles of rifle handling with the clarity and patience of a born teacher. "Before we touch a single firearm," Hannah was saying, "we must understand that these are tools, not toys. They demand respect and proper handling. The first rule is safety. Always assume a gun is loaded even when you're certain it isn't." The children listened with rapt attention, their expressions serious. In the frontier town, firearms were facts of life, but formal instruction in their proper use had been haphazard at best before the Blackwoods established this program. Eleanor moved among the students as Hannah continued the introductory lecture, making small adjustments to postures and stances even before weapons were distributed. Teaching came naturally to her, the skills honed through years of self-instruction now flowing easily to others. "Mrs. Blackwood," a small voice asked as she corrected a young girl's foot position, "is it true you once shot a buffalo while riding backward on a galloping horse?" Eleanor suppressed a smile at the embellished tale. "Not quite, though I did once take down a charging bull at full gallop, riding forward with both eyes open." "But you can shoot blindfolded, right?" another child pressed. "Everyone says so." Rather than dismiss the question, Eleanor considered it thoughtfully. "I can, but that skill came after years of practice, beginning with the basics we're teaching today. There are no shortcuts to mastery." As the lesson progressed from theory to practice, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. A year ago, she had lived in constant fear of her past being discovered. Now, her legendary abilities were acknowledged openly, even celebrated. The very skills that had once forced her into hiding had become her contribution to a community that valued her precisely because of her differences. By midday, each student had successfully fired their training rifle at the closest targets. The results varied widely, some natural marksmen, others struggling with basic aim, but all had demonstrated proper safety protocols and sincere effort. Eleanor and Hannah moved through the group, offering individualized guidance, creating an atmosphere of encouragement rather than competition. As the lesson concluded and the students began packing up their equipment, Eleanor noticed a wagon approaching from town, Martha Dawson's delivery cart, but driven today by Reverend Matthews. The pastor had been among the first to publicly support Eleanor's official position, arguing that her protective abilities represented a form of stewardship over the community. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called as the wagon drew closer. "A moment of your time, if you please." Eleanor excused herself from the students and approached the wagon. "Reverend, what brings you out to the farm today?" "News from the Federal Marshal's office in Denver," he replied, handing her an official-looking envelope. "Came by telegraph this morning. Martha suggested I deliver it personally." Eleanor accepted the envelope with a nod of thanks, breaking the seal to scan its contents. As she read, her expression shifted from curiosity to thoughtful consideration. "Good news?" the Reverend inquired. "Interesting news," Eleanor amended. "The Marshal Service is formalizing the Special Deputy Program based on the success here at McClintock Pass. They're seeking recommendations for other candidates with unconventional qualifications who might serve similar roles in strategic locations." The Reverend smiled knowingly. "They're looking for more Midnight Eleanors." "In a manner of speaking," she agreed, "though I doubt they'll find many women with my particular background." "Perhaps not, but the principle remains sound, recognizing that conventional qualifications aren't the only measure of capability." He gestured toward Hannah, who was demonstrating proper rifle cleaning to a group of attentive students. "Your daughter, for instance, combines your marksmanship with a natural gift for teaching. In time, she might make an excellent candidate herself." Eleanor watched Hannah with mixed emotions. Pride in her daughter's abilities, concern about the paths those abilities might lead her down. That would be her choice to make when she's ready. "Of course," the Reverend affirmed, "but the option exists now where it didn't before. You've opened a door, Mrs. Blackwood, not just for yourself, but for others who don't fit neatly into expected roles." As Reverend Matthews departed and the students began dispersing toward town, Eleanor found herself alone with Hannah in the training field. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the targets, many now bearing the marks of novice shots clustered around the outer rings. "They did well for their first lesson," Hannah observed, collecting the last of the training rifles. "Timothy Dawson has a natural eye. And Sarah Wilson, did you see how quickly she corrected her stance after just one suggestion?" Eleanor nodded, helping to gather the spent cartridges for reloading. "They're fortunate to have such an observant teacher." Hannah smiled at the compliment, then gestured toward the official envelope, still in Eleanor's hand. "Important news." "Potentially," Eleanor replied, explaining the Marshal Service's request. "They want me to help identify others who might serve as special deputies in strategic locations, people with unconventional skills but sound judgment." "Like us," Hannah said thoughtfully. "Women who can shoot, trackers with unusual methods, people who don't fit the traditional mold of lawmen." Eleanor studied her daughter's face, noting the spark of interest in her eyes. "It's a possibility for your future if you want it. Not the only one, of course." Hannah considered this as they walked back toward the house together. A year ago, I didn't even know who my mother really was. Now I'm teaching rifle skills to children and considering a future as some kind of special deputy. She shook her head in wonderment. Life takes unexpected turns. That it does, Eleanor agreed, remembering the terror and uncertainty she had felt when Hannah was kidnapped, an event that had seemed like the end of everything, but had instead become the beginning of something new and valuable. As they reached the porch, Eleanor paused, taking in the view of Silver Pine in the distance, the town that had become truly home in ways she had never anticipated. When I first came here, I thought I had to bury Midnight Eleanor to be accepted, to give you a normal life. I never imagined I could be both, the widow and the legend, the mother and the markswoman. Hannah leaned against her mother's shoulder, following her gaze toward the town. You never had to choose. You just needed people who could see you for everything you are. The setting sun gilded the edges of the mountains beyond McClintock Pass, the same passage that had once attracted Hawkins and his men with promises of illegal profit. Now it served as a protected route for legitimate commerce, travelers often timing their journeys to pass through during daylight hours when the legendary guardian of the pass might be glimpsed going about her duties. Some still called her Midnight Eleanor, especially visitors who knew the old stories of blindfolded buffalo hunts and exhibition shooting. Others, particularly the townspeople of Silver Pine, simply called her Mrs. Blackwood, with a respect that encompassed both her ordinary contributions and her extraordinary abilities. A few, federal marshals and officials, addressed her as Special Deputy Blackwood, according to the formal recognition her role deserved, but to Hannah she was simply Mama. A woman who had finally found a way to reconcile all aspects of herself into a coherent whole. A woman who had discovered that her greatest strength lay not in hiding her differences, but in embracing them, using them to protect what mattered most. As mother and daughter entered their home together, the Sharps rifle standing ready beside, the door and jars of fresh preserves cooling on the kitchen table, Eleanor Blackwood felt the familiar peace of belonging truly and completely to a place that valued her for exactly who she was, past, present, and whatever the future might hold. The legend of Midnight Eleanor, who once hunted buffalo blindfolded, had not ended with her retirement to a quiet widow's life in Silver Pine. Instead, it had evolved into something more enduring, a legacy of protection, education, and the courage to stand revealed in one's full complexity. A legacy that would continue through Hannah and the children she taught, through the special deputy program Eleanor would help shape, and through a town that had learned to see beyond appearances to the remarkable capabilities that sometimes hide in the most unexpected places. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.